The mop handle felt heavier than usual.
This
Walter
changes
Brennan's calloused
everything.
hands
You need
as he
to see
pushed it
this
across
now.
the marble floor of courtroom 302, the same floor he had crossed 1,000 times before, though never like this, never with the weight of 15 years pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. The autumn sun of Manhattan filtered through the tall windows of the federal courthouse, casting long streaks of golden light across the stone he had just finished polishing. And somewhere in the distance, a clock was ticking toward 9 in the morning, toward the moment that would change everything. He was 62 years old. His hair had gone mostly silver at the temples, not the distinguished silver of wealthy men who age gracefully in corner offices, but the dull gray of sleepless nights and meals eaten standing up in basement cafeterias. His Navy maintenance uniform bore the word maintenance embroidered on the chest pocket, the threads fraying slightly at the edges after 15 years of washing in cold water to save on electricity bills. The uniform itself had been replaced twice in all that time, and both times Walter had felt a strange grief as though he were burying a friend. The courtroom was empty at this hour, just Walter and the ghosts of all the cases that had passed through these walls. He knew every scratch on the mahogany railings, every water stain on the ceiling tiles, every loose floorboard near the jury box that creaked when stepped on at the wrong angle. This was his kingdom now, this realm of brass fixtures and polished wood, and he had made peace with that fact in the way a man makes peace with a prison cell when he realizes he may never leave. The defendant's table stood near the front 6 leather chairs arranged in a row, and Walter paused his mopping to look at them. In a few hours, those chairs would be occupied by lawyers charging $8,000 an hour, lawyers who would argue over billions, while Walter pushed his cart back to the maintenance closet and clocked out for lunch. But something was different about today. Walter could feel it in the air, in the way the morning light seemed sharper than usual, in the way his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the mop handle. The Ashford case was starting this morning, the biggest intellectual property dispute to hit Manhattan in a decade, and the entire legal world was watching. Catherine Ashford, the tech billionaire accused of stealing quantum computing technology from a startup called Prometheus Systems. Walter had followed the case from the beginning, not through newspapers or television, but through the conversations he overheard while emptying trash cans and wiping down tables. Lawyers talked freely in front of the maintenance staff because maintenance staff were furniture invisible, not worth noticing. Walter Brennan had been invisible for 15 years. He finished mopping the last section of floor near the witness stand and stepped back to inspect his work. The marble gleamed under the fluorescent lights, pristine and perfect, the way he always left it. A man could take pride in a well-mopped floor even if no one else noticed. That was what Elena had taught him in those dark years after everything fell apart. Find dignity in small things, find purpose in the work of your hands, and never let them take your soul, even if they take everything else. Elena. Even now, the thought of her name sent a tremor through his chest, a grief that time had softened but never erased. Walter checked his watch. 7:15. He had 90 minutes before the courtroom opened for the trial, 90 minutes to finish his rounds and disappear back into the invisible world of maintenance corridors and supply closets. He gathered his supplies onto the cart, the bottles of cleaning solution and the rolls of paper towels and the worn rubber gloves he had been using since March, and pushed it toward the door. The hallway outside courtroom 302 was still quiet, the morning staff just beginning to trickle in with their coffee cups and their briefcases and their expensive suits. Walter nodded at a security guard he had known for a decade, a man named Harrison, who always asked about his daughter, even though Walter never had much to tell him. Rachel was in San Francisco now, working at some tech company, living a life so different from his own that their monthly phone calls felt like conversations between strangers. The maintenance closet on the 3rd floor was cramped and poorly lit, a space barely large enough for his cart and a small folding chair he had brought from home years ago. Walter sat down and pulled out a thermos of black coffee, the same thermos he had carried every day since Elena gave it to him for their 20th anniversary. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, made at 4 in the morning in his tiny Queens apartment before the sun came up, but it was his and he had earned it. He closed his eyes and let the silence settle around him, the brief peace before another day of being no one. But even in the darkness behind his eyelids, Walter could not escape the memories. They came unbidden, as they always did, fragments of a life that had been taken from him piece by piece. 40 years ago, Walter Brennan had been a boy from Ohio with dirt under his fingernails and dreams bigger than the coal mines that had swallowed his father. Frank Brennan had worked 12-hour shifts in the darkness underground 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, extracting the black rock that powered America's factories and homes. He was a quiet man, Frank, with hands like leather and a back that bent more each year from the weight of the earth above him. Walter remembered the way his father came home each evening, covered in coal dust, the fine black particles embedded in the creases of his face, and the lines of his palms so deep that no amount of scrubbing could ever wash them away completely. His mother would heat water on the stove, and Frank would wash in the kitchen basin, and Walter would sit at the table doing his homework and watching his father transform from a shadow into a man. The only question Frank ever asked, "You finish your schoolwork, boy?" And Walter every night would answer, "Yes, sir." Frank Brennan never got past the 8th grade. The mines had taken him at 14, the same age his father had been taken and his grandfather before that. It was the way of things in their town, a small place in southeastern Ohio, where the hills were hollowed out and the rivers ran black with runoff, and the men died young from lungs full of dust. But Frank had a belief that burned in him, like the eternal fires that sometimes smoldered in the abandoned shafts, a belief that education was the only escape, the only way to break the chain that had bound his family to the darkness for generations. Walter never forgot the night Frank came home with the acceptance letter from Keown from Columbia Law School. It had arrived in a thick envelope, the kind that meant good news, and Walter had been afraid to open it. He was 17 years old, the smartest kid in his high school class by a mile, but smart didn't mean anything where he came from. Smart boys still went into the mines. Smart boys still married local girls and had children who would grow up to do the same. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 3 hours while Frank finished his shift, while Walter's mother made dinner, while the sun set over the hills and the stars came out one by one. When Frank finally walked through the door, he saw the envelope immediately. He stopped in the doorway, his face still black with coal, and he looked at his son with eyes that held something Walter had never seen before. "Open it," Frank said, just those 2 words, quiet and rough. Walter's hands shook as he tore the envelope. The letter inside was typed on heavy cream paper, the words blurring as his eyes filled with tears. "Full scholarship," Walter read aloud. "They're giving me a full scholarship." Frank Brennan, the man who had never cried in front of anyone, turned away and wiped his face with his blackened hand. When he turned back, there were clean streaks down his cheeks where the tears had washed the coal dust away. "You make me proud, Walter." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You make me so proud." 2 months later, Frank Brennan was dead. The diagnosis came in July. Black lung disease stage 4. The coal dust that had accumulated in his lungs for 33 years finally claiming its due. The doctor said he might have 6 months, maybe a year, if he stopped working immediately, but Frank refused to quit. The mine was all he knew, and there were bills to pay, and Walter's mother needed the insurance that would only continue as long as Frank kept working. He lasted until September. Walter was 3 weeks into his first semester at Columbia when the phone call came. His mother's voice on the other end of the line, distant and broken, telling him to come home, telling him it was time. He hitchhiked through the night, arriving at the hospital in the gray hours before dawn, and found his father in a bed that seemed too small for a man who had carried the weight of the earth on his shoulders. Frank's eyes were closed when Walter walked in, but they opened at the sound of his footsteps. "You came," Frank whispered. His voice was like wind through dead leaves barely there. "Of course I came." "Shouldn't have. You got classes, you got studying." "I'll catch up." Frank's hand, pale and thin, now reached out and found Walter's. The grip was weak, nothing like the iron strength Walter remembered from childhood, but it was there. "Listen to me, boy." Frank's eyes found his son's face, and even in their clouded depths, there was an intensity that made Walter lean closer. "You're going to be something. You're going to help people like me, people who get chewed up by the system and spit out like nothing. You promise me." "I promise, Dad." "Say it again." "I promise. I'll be a lawyer. I'll fight for people like you." Frank nodded, satisfied. His eyes closed again and his grip on Walter's hand loosened. "Your mama's going to need you to be strong, but you don't come back here to stay. You hear me? You go back to that school and you finish what you started. That's how you honor me. Not by staying here and mourning, by becoming everything I never could." Those were the last coherent words Frank Brennan ever spoke. He died 3 days later on a Sunday morning when the bells were ringing at the church down the street. Walter was holding his hand when it happened, and he felt the exact moment when his father's spirit left his body, a subtle shift, like air pressure changing before a storm. His mother wept beside him, but Walter didn't cry. He had made a promise, and crying felt like weakness, and he could not afford to be weak. At the funeral, standing beside the open grave with dirt piling up on the simple wooden coffin, Walter made another promise, this one silent and private. He would become a lawyer. He would protect people like his father, working men and women who were exploited and forgotten, and treated like disposable parts in a machine designed to benefit the wealthy and powerful. He would fight for them with every breath in his body, every hour of every day, until justice was no longer a privilege reserved for those who could afford it. Walter Brennan kept that promise for 20 years. Columbia Law School had been a revelation, a world so different from the coal-dusted hills of Ohio that Walter sometimes felt like he had traveled to another planet. The other students came from prep schools and wealthy families, from summer homes in the Hamptons and winter vacations in Aspen, and they looked at Walter with his second-hand suits in his calloused hands and his accent that still carried traces of Appalachian hills, with something between curiosity and contempt. But Walter didn't care about their opinions. He cared about the law, about the elegant machinery of justice that could protect the weak from the strong, if only someone knew how to operate it properly. He graduated at the top of his class in 1987, and within a week he had 3 job offers from major Manhattan firms. He chose Whitfield and Partners not because they paid the most, but because they had a pro bono program that allowed associates to take on cases for clients who couldn't afford representation. It was a small thing, a token gesture from a firm that made its real money representing corporations in billion-dollar disputes, but it was enough for Walter. He would work their cases during the day and fight for the people at night and on weekends, and slowly, piece by piece, he would build a reputation. The reputation came faster than he expected. By 30, Walter Brennan had a corner office overlooking Central Park, a partnership track that was the envy of his peers, and a name that was whispered in legal circles as someone to watch. By 35, he had become the youngest partner in the firm's history, specializing in class action lawsuits that pitted ordinary workers against the corporations that exploited them. Factory workers exposed to toxic chemicals. Miners denied compensation for workplace injuries. Employees fired illegally for reporting safety violations. The cases no one else wanted to touch because they were expensive and time-consuming, and the clients couldn't pay. Walter took them all. "You're insane," his colleagues told him over and over in conference rooms and cocktail parties and the quiet moments between depositions. "These cases cost more than they bring in. You're sabotaging your own career." But Walter just smiled and shook his head and kept working. The money had never mattered to him. What mattered was the look in a client's eyes when they realized someone was finally listening. Someone was finally fighting for them. Someone finally saw them as human beings worthy of justice. It was at a trial in 1980 that Walter met Elena. The case was a wrongful termination suit. A factory worker named Miguel Martinez, who had been fired after 25 years because he reported unsafe working conditions to the state labor board. The company claimed he was let go due to budget cuts, but Walter had documents proving they had hired 3 new workers the same week they fired Miguel. It was an open and shut case, the kind Walter could win in his sleep, but something about it felt personal. Miguel reminded him of his father, quiet, hard-working, proud, destroyed by a system that treated him as expendable. Elena Martinez was Miguel's daughter. She took the witness stand on the second day of the trial, a young woman with dark hair and amber eyes that seemed to hold all the warmth of autumn. Walter had interviewed her before the trial, going over her testimony, preparing her for cross-examination, but nothing had prepared him for the way she looked at him from the witness box, direct and unafraid. "Miss Martinez," Walter said, his voice professionally calm, even as his heart hammered against his ribs, "can you describe what happened on the day your father was terminated?" Elena's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that Walter would come to know and love over the years ahead. "They called him into the manager's office at 2 in the afternoon. He had been at that factory since before I was born, 25 years, and they gave him 15 minutes to clean out his locker and leave." "Did they provide a reason?" "They said the budget was being restructured. They said his position was being eliminated." Elena's voice remained steady, but Walter could see the anger burning behind her eyes. But everyone knew the truth. He filed a safety complaint 2 months earlier after a machine malfunction nearly killed a coworker. The company was supposed to replace the equipment, but they decided it was cheaper to get rid of the man who complained. Walter nodded, letting her words hang in the air for the jury to absorb. "And how did this affect your family?" "My father is 61 years old. He gave that company his entire adult life. He missed my quinceañera because he was working overtime. He missed my graduation because he was covering a shift. He gave them everything and they threw him away like garbage. Elena's hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white. He hasn't been the same since. He sits in his chair and stares at the wall, and I don't know how to reach him anymore. The jury awarded Miguel Martinez $2 million in damages, the largest wrongful termination verdict in the state that year. But Walter didn't celebrate the victory. Instead, he broke every rule in the legal profession and asked Elena Martinez to have coffee with him the day after the trial concluded. "Is this ethical?" she asked, one eyebrow raised, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The case is closed," Walter replied. "You're not a witness anymore. You're just a woman I would very much like to get to know better." That was smooth, counselor. I've been practicing that line for 2 days. Elena laughed, and the sound was like music to Walter's ears, like bells ringing on a clear morning, like everything good he had ever hoped for wrapped up in a single moment. They were married in the spring of '91 in a small ceremony in Central Park, with only close friends and family in attendance. Elena wore a simple white dress that she had bought on sale at Macy's, and Walter thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His mother came up from Ohio for the wedding, frail and gray, but beaming with joy, and she pulled Walter aside after the ceremony to whisper in his ear. "Your father would be so proud," she said. "You found a good one, Walter. Don't ever let her go." "I won't, Mama, I promise." Rachel Brennan was born in December of that same year, a tiny pink bundle who screamed with impressive lungs and looked up at her parents with eyes that would later turn the same amber shade as her mother's. Walter held his daughter for the first time in the hospital room, while Elena slept exhausted from 20 hours of labor, and he felt something shift inside him, a tectonic realignment of everything he thought he knew about love and purpose and what it meant to be alive. "I'm going to protect you," he whispered to the infant in his arms. "I'm going to give you a life your grandfather never had, I promise." The years that followed were the happiest of Walter's life. He continued his work at the firm, taking on bigger and more complicated cases, building a reputation that extended far beyond Manhattan. Time magazine did a profile on him in 1998, calling him the defender of the invisible, a lawyer who had made it his mission to give voice to the voiceless. The article included a photograph of Walter at his desk, surrounded by case files, his hair still dark, then his eyes still bright with idealism. At home, life was full in ways that made Walter's childhood poverty seem like a distant dream. They bought a house in Westchester, a beautiful colonial, with a yard where Rachel could play and a study where Walter could work late into the night. Elena continued teaching elementary school, turning down several offers to take administrative positions because she loved being in the classroom with the children, loved watching their faces light up when they finally understood something difficult. They had dinner together every night that Walter wasn't in trial, the three of them around the kitchen table talking about their days. Rachel grew from a screaming infant into a curious toddler, into a precocious child who asked questions about everything and read books far above her grade level. She looked like her mother, but had her father's stubborn streak, the refusal to accept injustice that ran in the Brennan blood like a hereditary disease. "Why do some people have so much and other people have so little?" Rachel asked one evening when she was 8 years old after they had passed a homeless man on the street in Manhattan. Walter and Elena exchanged a glance, the silent communication of parents who have been married long enough to read each other's thoughts. "Because the world isn't fair," Walter said carefully. "But that doesn't mean we accept it. We try to make it better, one person at a time, one case at a time." "Is that why you're a lawyer?" "That's exactly why I'm a lawyer." Rachel nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity of a child who already understood more about the world than most adults. Those were the good years, the golden years, the years Walter would later look back on with a longing so intense it felt like physical pain. He didn't know then how fragile happiness could be, how quickly everything could shatter when the wrong forces aligned against you. The beginning of the end came in 2009. Walter was 47 years old at the height of his career, his name synonymous with worker advocacy across the country. He had won cases that changed laws, forced companies to reform their practices, sent a message to the corporate world that exploitation would not go unchallenged. His office wall was covered with plaques and awards, but what he treasured most were the letters from former clients, handwritten notes from factory workers and miners and truck drivers thanking him for giving them their dignity back. It was a Thursday evening in March when the phone call came. Walter was working late in his office, preparing for a trial that was scheduled to begin the following week, when his secretary buzzed him on the intercom. "There's a man here to see you, Mr. Brennan. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent. His name is James Whitmore. Send him in. The man who entered Walter's office was in his early 50s with thinning gray hair and eyes that darted around the room like a cornered animal's. He wore a rumpled suit that had seen better days and carried a leather briefcase that he clutched to his chest like a shield. Mr. Brennan, Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't know where else to go. Walter gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please sit down. Tell me what's going on. Whitmore sat but perched on the edge of the seat as if ready to bolt at any moment. His hands trembled as he opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. I'm a safety engineer at Dominion Energy Corporation. I've worked there for 18 years. He paused, swallowing hard. What I'm about to show you could get me killed. Walter leaned forward, his instincts sharpening. Go on. There's a nuclear power plant in upstate New York called Millbrook. I've been responsible for safety assessments there for the past 5 years. Whitmore spread the papers on Walter's desk with shaking hands. 2 years ago, during a routine inspection, I discovered a critical flaw in the cooling system. The backup pumps were defective. If the primary system failed, there would be nothing to prevent a meltdown. Did you report this? Of course I reported it. I filed 3 separate reports with my supervisors detailing the problem and recommending immediate repairs. Whitmore's voice cracked with a mixture of fear and outrage. Do you know what they did? They ran a cost-benefit analysis. They calculated that repairing the cooling system would cost $40 million. Then they calculated the potential liability, if there was an accident, lawsuit settlements, regulatory fines. And they concluded it was cheaper to do nothing. Walter felt his blood run cold. They decided to risk a nuclear accident because fixing the problem was too expensive. That's exactly what they decided. Whitmore pulled out another document, this one marked confidential in red letters. This is the internal memo authorizing the decision. It was signed by 3 members of the executive board, including the CEO. Walter examined the document. The language was clinical detached, discussing the potential deaths of human beings in the same tone one might use to discuss inventory management. 6 months ago, Whitmore continued, his voice dropping even lower. There was an incident, a minor malfunction in the primary cooling system. It was contained within minutes and the backup pumps never had to activate. Officially, it was classified as a routine maintenance issue. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. 3 workers were exposed to radiation during the incident. The company's official report says the exposure was within safe limits. But I've seen the actual readings. Those men received doses that will almost certainly cause cancer within the next decade. And the company is covering this up. The company is doing everything it can to make sure no one ever finds out. They falsified records, intimidated witnesses, and made it clear to everyone at the plant that speaking out would be career suicide. Whitmore looked up at Walter, his eyes pleading. I have a wife and 2 kids, Mr. Brennan. I know what I'm risking by coming here. But those 3 workers have families too. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve compensation for what was done to them. Walter sat back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. Dominion Energy was one of the largest corporations in America, with revenues in the tens of billions and political connections that reached the highest levels of government. Taking them on would be like declaring war on a superpower. But he thought of his father dying slowly from lungs full of coal dust, while the mining company that employed him denied any responsibility. He thought of all the invisible people he had sworn to protect the workers who were chewed up and spit out by a system designed to maximize profit at any human cost. I'll take your case, Walter said. Whitmore's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions. Relief, gratitude, and then a deeper, darker fear. You understand what this means. They'll come after you. They'll do everything in their power to destroy you. Let them try. Walter had no idea in that moment how prophetic those words would prove to be. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of preparation. Walter assembled a team of associates investigators and expert witnesses. He gathered evidence, internal documents, witness statements, scientific analyses. He filed the lawsuit in federal court, alleging negligence, fraud, and conspiracy to cover up a public safety hazard. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Dominion Energy was facing the most damaging public relations crisis in its history. But Dominion Energy did not become a multi-billion-dollar corporation by losing fights. Their response was swift and overwhelming. They hired an army of lawyers from the most prestigious firms in the country. They launched a media counteroffensive portraying Walter as an ambulance chaser looking for a payday. They sent private investigators to dig into his past, his finances, his personal life, searching for anything that could be used to discredit him. Walter expected all of this. What he did not expect was the sophistication of their ultimate attack. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Walter came home late from the office to find his front door slightly ajar. He knew immediately that something was wrong. Elena was visiting her parents in New Jersey with Rachel, who was home from college for spring break. The house should have been empty and locked. Walter pushed the door open slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The living room looked untouched, but when he went to his study, he found chaos. The drawers of his desk had been pulled out and dumped on the floor. His file cabinet had been pried open, and his laptop, the computer that contained years of case files and research and correspondence, was gone. He called the police, but some instinct told him this was not a random burglary. His television was still there. Elena's jewelry was untouched in the bedroom upstairs. Only the laptop had been taken along with the backup drive he kept in his desk drawer. The next morning, before Walter could fully process what had happened, he received a call from the New York State Bar Association. "Mr. Brennan, this is Margaret Chen, Chief Disciplinary Counsel. We've received a complaint against you that requires immediate investigation. I need you to come to our offices today." Walter felt the floor shift beneath his feet. What kind of complaint? "I can't discuss the details over the phone, but I should warn you, based on the evidence we've received, your license to practice law is in serious jeopardy." The evidence, as Walter would soon discover, was damning. Someone had provided the Bar Association with documents purporting to show that Walter had fabricated evidence in the Dominion case. There were emails supposedly from Walter's account discussing plans to create false documents. There were recordings of phone conversations, Walter's voice unmistakably captured, talking about bribing witnesses and manufacturing expert testimony. There were financial records showing suspicious payments into offshore accounts that Walter had never heard of. It was all fake, every piece of it constructed with a sophistication that bordered on genius. The emails had digital signatures that appeared to be authentic. The voice recordings had been synthesized using technology that was in 2009 cutting edge and almost impossible to detect. The financial records had been created by hacking into banking systems and inserting false transactions. But none of that mattered. The evidence looked real, and the Bar Association was obligated to investigate. Walter was suspended from practice immediately pending the outcome of the investigation. The firm, Whitfield and Partners, the place where he had worked for more than 20 years, called him into the managing partner's office the same day. "Walter, I don't know what to say." David Whitfield, the founder's grandson, looked genuinely pained. "You've been like family here, but the allegations, we can't have this hanging over the firm. You understand? You're firing me. We're asking for your resignation, for everyone's sake." Walter cleaned out his office that afternoon, filling cardboard boxes with 2 decades of memories, while his former colleagues avoided eye contact in the hallways. The photograph of Elena and Rachel that had sat on his desk, the plaque commemorating his first big verdict, the letter from his mother telling him how proud his father would have been. All of it went into boxes that he would never fully unpack. The newspapers ran the story the next day. "Star lawyer accused of fabricating evidence." The headlines were everywhere on news sites and television broadcasts and social media feeds. People who had called Walter a hero were now calling him a fraud. Former clients issued statements expressing their disappointment in betrayal. The talking heads on cable news wondered how anyone had ever trusted him. And then James Whitmore died. The official report said it was suicide. Whitmore's body was found in his car in a parking garage, a single gunshot wound to the head. A note was discovered nearby, typed and unsigned, expressing remorse for his role in spreading lies about Dominion Energy. The case against the company, already weakened by Walter's suspension, collapsed entirely. Walter knew it was murder. He knew it with every fiber of his being, the same way he knew the fabricated evidence was fabricated. But he had no way to prove it, and no one was interested in listening to the ravings of a disgraced attorney. The investigation into Walter's conduct lasted 4 years. 4 years of hearings and depositions and expert testimony. 4 years of Walter's life suspended in limbo, unable to practice law, unable to find any other meaningful employment, unable to do anything except fight for his reputation while the world had already moved on. And during those 4 years, Elena got sick. The diagnosis came in the second year, ovarian cancer, stage 3. By the time they caught it, the disease had already spread to her lymph nodes. Without his income from the firm, without the health insurance that had covered their family, the cost of treatment was astronomical. They sold the house in Westchester, first the home where they had raised Rachel, where they had hosted Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties and lazy Sunday mornings reading the newspaper together. The money from the sale covered 3 months of chemotherapy. Then they sold the cars, then the furniture, then Elena's modest jewelry collection, including the engagement ring Walter had saved for 6 months to buy. Everything that could be converted to one went toward the mounting medical bills. They moved into a small apartment in Queens, 2 rooms and a kitchenette that felt like a closet after the sprawling colonial they had left behind. Rachel, who was 21 and in her final year of college, wanted to drop out and come home to help, but Walter and Elena both forbade it. "You finish your degree," Elena said from the hospital bed where she spent more and more of her time. "Don't let what's happening to us derail your life. That's not what we want." Rachel protested, but she stayed in school. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science, and the day she received her diploma, Elena smiled through her morphine haze and said it was the proudest moment of her life. 2 months later, Elena was gone. She died in the gray hours before dawn in the cramped bedroom of their Queens apartment, with Walter holding her hand just as he had held his father's hand all those years ago. The cancer had eaten through her body like fire, through dry wood, taking her piece by piece until there was nothing left but a shell. But even in the end, even when the pain was too much to bear, she had never lost her spirit. "Don't let them win," she whispered to Walter on one of her final nights when she was still lucid enough to speak. "Promise me you won't let them take who you are." "I promise, Elena. I'll fight. I'll always fight." "No." Her grip on his hand tightened with a strength he didn't know she still possessed. "Not just fight. Stay good. Stay kind. Be the man I fell in love with, the man who sees invisible people and fights for them. Don't let the anger consume you. Promise me." "I promise." Elena's eyes closed and her grip loosened, and a few days later, she was gone. Walter's mother died 3 months after that, as if the weight of all the family's tragedy had finally crushed her. She had never fully recovered from Frank's death, and watching her grandson struggle through his scandal and her daughter-in-law waste away from cancer was more than her aged heart could bear. In the span of 5 years, Walter Brennan lost his career, his reputation, his wife, his mother, and everything he had spent a lifetime building. When the Bar Association finally cleared him of all charges in 2013, concluding that the evidence against him had been fabricated by unknown parties, it felt less like vindication than like a cruel joke. The damage was done. His name was still associated with scandal in the minds of those who remembered. No law firm would touch him. His license was restored, but what good was a license without anyone willing to hire him? He found work as a janitor at the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. It was the only job he could get. The irony was not lost on him, cleaning the floors of the courtrooms where he had once argued cases, emptying the trash cans of lawyers who were now doing the work he used to do. But Walter took the job without complaint because bills still needed to be paid and rent still came due on the first of the month, and self-pity was a luxury he could not afford. That was 15 years ago. The coffee in Walter's thermos had gone cold while he sat in the maintenance closet lost in memories. He shook himself back to the present, checked his watch, and saw that it was nearly 9 o'clock. The Ashford trial was about to begin. He should have stayed in the closet, should have found some other floor to mop, some other bathroom to clean. What was happening in courtroom 302 was none of his business anymore. He was maintenance staff, now invisible, irrelevant. But something pulled him back to the courtroom anyway. He told himself he just wanted to see the setup before the trial began, make sure his mopping job had held up. But the truth was different, harder to admit. He wanted to see a trial one more time. He wanted to remember what it felt like to be part of that world, even if only as a spectator, hidden in plain sight. The courtroom was filling up when Walter slipped in through a side door. Reporters crowded the gallery, their laptops open, their phones clutched in their hands, ready to document every moment of what promised to be the trial of the decade. The public seating was packed with curious observers, law students, and tech industry watchers who wanted to see Catherine Ashford in person. Walter positioned himself near the back wall next to his cleaning cart where he could observe without being observed. The bailiff nodded at him with a familiarity born of long acquaintance. Walter was furniture, after all, part of the courtroom's permanent fixtures. At the prosecution table, a man Walter recognized as Richard Thornton was arranging papers with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Thornton was 55, a partner at Morrison and Blackwell, one of the most expensive law firms in the country. His gray suit probably cost more than Walter's monthly salary. He had the sleek, well-fed look of a man who had never known want, who had never eaten a meal standing up in a basement cafeteria, who had never worried about how he would pay next month's rent. But it was the defense table that drew Walter's attention. Catherine Ashford sat alone. She was 41 years old with blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun and blue eyes that had graced the covers of Forbes and Wired and Time magazine. She wore an Armani suit that was impeccably tailored, and her posture was straight and confident, the bearing of a woman who had built a $12 billion company from nothing. But Walter had spent 40 years reading people, and he could see what others might miss: the tension in her clasped hands, the tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her jaw. Catherine Ashford was terrified, and she was alone. 6 leather chairs sat beside her at the defense table, all of them empty. Walter knew those chairs were supposed to be occupied by lawyers from Morrison and Blackwell's rival firm, Harrison Monroe and Partners, a team that Catherine had hired at the rate of $8,000 an hour to defend her against the charges. They were not there. Walter checked his watch, 9:15. The trial was supposed to begin in 15 minutes. He watched Catherine pull out her phone and make a call, her face growing paler with each passing second. Then another call, then another. Each time she put the phone down, she looked more desperate, more lost. Walter had seen this before. Not at this scale, not in this courtroom, but the pattern was unmistakable. The isolation of a target, the abandonment at the crucial moment, the systematic distortion of someone who had become inconvenient to powerful interests. It was exactly what they had done to him. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, and everyone stood as Judge Margaret Hayes entered the courtroom. She was 65 years old with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that gave nothing away. Walter knew her reputation: fair but ruthless, with no tolerance for grandstanding or time wasting. She had been on the bench for 30 years and had seen everything. Judge Hayes took her seat and surveyed the courtroom, her eyes narrowing when they landed on the empty chairs beside Catherine Ashford. "Miss Ashford," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "where is your legal team?" Catherine rose, trying to maintain her composure, but her voice wavered. "I don't know, Your Honor. They were here yesterday for the final preparation meeting. I've tried reaching them all morning, but no one is answering." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Reporters began typing furiously on their laptops. Richard Thornton rose from the prosecution table, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your Honor, it appears the defense has been abandoned. We move for a default judgment." Judge Hayes held up a hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Thornton." She turned back to Catherine. "Miss Ashford, do you have any explanation for your counsel's absence?" "No, Your Honor. I've left messages with every member of the team. I don't understand what's happening. The court is sympathetic to your situation, but we cannot delay indefinitely." Judge Hayes glanced at the clock on the wall. "If you cannot secure representation within the next few minutes, I may have no choice but to proceed without defense counsel or grant the plaintiff's motion." Catherine's face went white. Walter could see her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. And in that moment, something stirred in Walter's chest. He thought of Elena dying in that cramped Queens apartment, making him promise to stay good, stay kind, be the man she fell in love with. He thought of his father emerging from the coal mines every night asking if he had finished his schoolwork. He thought of all the invisible people he had sworn to protect and how he had spent the last 15 years breaking that promise one day at a time. He thought of Catherine Ashford alone and terrified, facing the full power of a system designed to crush anyone who stood in its way. Before he fully understood what he was doing, Walter Brennan stepped away from his cleaning cart. "I will represent her." His voice was not loud, but it carried through the courtroom with a clarity that silenced every other sound. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward him, the elderly man in the maintenance uniform, the mop still in his hand, standing in the aisle like a ghost from another era. Catherine Ashford stared at him with undisguised shock. Richard Thornton's face twisted into a smirk. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A janitor cannot—" "I'm a member of the New York State Bar." Walter interrupted, his voice steady now, stronger than it had been in years. "My license is valid." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, the old leather wallet that Elena had given him 35 years ago. From it, he extracted a card that he had carried every day for 15 years, though he had never expected to use it again. His bar card. Judge Hayes examined the card, her expression unreadable. The courtroom was utterly silent, the tension so thick it seemed to have weight and substance. Walter Brennan, she read aloud, admitted to the New York bar in 1987. She looked up at him. Mr. Brennan, how long has it been since you practiced law? 15 years, Your Honor. And you believe you are still competent to handle a case of this magnitude? Walter met her gaze without flinching. This woman deserves representation. She deserves someone who will fight for her. I know the law, I know procedure, and I understand what justice means. The whispers in the gallery swelled to a dull roar. Reporters were typing so fast their keyboards sounded like rainfall. Richard Thornton's face had gone from smug to uncertain to something approaching alarm. Judge Hayes turned to Catherine. Miss Ashford, do you accept Mr. Brennan as your counsel? Catherine looked at Walter, really looked at him for the first time. He saw her taking in his worn uniform, his calloused hands, his silver hair. He saw her searching his face for something, some indication of who he was and why he was doing this. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, I accept Mr. Brennan as my attorney. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hayes banged her gavel, calling for order, but even she seemed slightly stunned by the turn of events. Very well, she said when the noise had died down to a manageable level. Mr. Brennan, you have 15 minutes to confer with your client before we proceed. Do not waste them. Thank you, Your Honor. Walter walked down the aisle toward the defense table, aware of every eye following his progress. He felt something he had not felt in 15 years alive. The numbness that had wrapped around his heart like a shroud was cracking, and underneath it, something was stirring. He set the mop against the wall, the mop that had been his only tool for a decade and a half, and sat down beside Catherine Ashford. Something is very wrong here, he whispered, leaning close so only she could hear. This isn't just your lawyers abandoning you. Everything has been orchestrated. Catherine's eyes widened. How do you know? Because I've seen it before. 15 years ago, they did the same thing to me. Her breath caught. Who? We'll find out. But first, I need you to tell me everything. We have 15 minutes. Don't hold anything back. Catherine studied his face for a long moment. The weathered skin, the deep brown eyes that held something she recognized. Something she had seen in her own mirror during the darkest nights of this ordeal. The exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone for too long. Where do I start? The beginning. Tell me about your technology. Tell me about Prometheus. Tell me everything that led to this moment. And so in whispered fragments, Catherine Ashford began to talk. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, the daughter of an engineer and a nurse, the first person in her family to attend an Ivy League school. She told him about MIT, about the professor who said her ideas were impossible, about the 6 years she spent in a studio apartment, barely bigger than a walk-in closet, working on equations that everyone said would never amount to anything. She told him about quantum computing, about qubits and superposition, and the fundamental problem that had stymied researchers for decades, maintaining coherence at temperatures above absolute zero. She told him about her breakthrough, the insight that came to her at 3 in the morning, when she was so exhausted she could barely see straight, the realization that instead of fighting instability, she could harness it. She told him about Ashford Technologies, started with $5,000 and a patent that no one believed would work. She told him about the years of struggle, the investors who laughed at her, the male colleagues who dismissed her, the slow and painful climb from obscurity to success. And she told him about Prometheus Systems. They appeared 3 years ago. Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled anger. A startup claiming to have developed quantum processing technology independently. But their timing was suspicious. They filed their first patents exactly 2 months after I presented my research at a major conference. And now they're claiming you stole their work. That's exactly what they're claiming. They say I used industry connections to access their internal research and copied their designs. It's insane. I have documentation proving I developed this technology years before Prometheus even existed. But no one wants to hear it. Walter's mind was racing, processing information, drawing connections. Your previous lawyers, how did they respond to this defense? Catherine's face darkened. They told me not to worry. They said they had a strategy. They said introducing my original research notes wasn't necessary. Not necessary. Walter felt a cold fury building in his chest. Your best evidence, and they told you not to use it. I trusted them. They came highly recommended. They cost $3 million. And now they've vanished at the worst possible moment. Yes. Walter leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the courtroom. Thornton at the prosecution table shuffling papers with affected nonchalance. The reporters in the gallery hungry for blood. Judge Hayes watching them with an expression that was impossible to read. "Miss Ashford," Walter said quietly, "your lawyers weren't incompetent. They were sabotaging you." The color drained from Catherine's face. "What?" "Think about it. Every strategic decision they made weakened your case. Critical evidence excluded. Key witnesses never called. And now they disappear at the exact moment when their absence would cause maximum damage." He met her eyes. "Someone paid them to lose. The question is who and why." Before Catherine could respond, the bailiff announced that their 15 minutes were up. Judge Hayes called the court to order. "Mr. Brennan, are you prepared to make your opening statement?" Walter stood slowly. His joints ached from years of physical labor, and his heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. 15 years since he had last stood in a courtroom as an attorney. 15 years of mopping floors and emptying trash cans and being invisible. But as he walked to the podium, something remarkable happened. The fear began to recede, replaced by something older and deeper instinct. 40 years of legal training, of courtroom battles, of arguments won and lost rose up inside him like a tide. He placed his hands on the podium and looked at the 12 faces in the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm and clear. "My name is Walter Brennan. I must apologize for my appearance. I'm not wearing an expensive suit like my colleague across the aisle. I don't have a prestigious office or a team of assistants. Less than an hour ago, I was mopping the floor of this very courtroom." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Walter let it pass. "But 15 years ago, I stood in courtrooms like this one as an attorney. I represented workers against corporations, ordinary people against powerful interests. I believed then, as I believe now, that justice should not depend on the size of your bank account or the prestige of your law firm. Justice should depend on one thing and one thing only: the truth." He paused, letting the words settle. "The truth in this case is simple. Catherine Ashford stole nothing. She created revolutionary technology through her own intellect, her own labor, her own genius. And someone very wealthy and very powerful wants to take that technology away from her." Richard Thornton rose. "Objection. Counsel is arguing not making an opening statement." "Sustained," Judge Hayes said. "Mr. Brennan, confine yourself to the facts." Walter nodded. "My apologies, Your Honor. I will let the evidence speak for itself. And I promise this jury one thing: by the time this trial is over, it will be unmistakably clear who is telling the truth and who is lying." He returned to the defense table and sat down. His hands were trembling slightly, hidden beneath the table where no one could see. Catherine leaned toward him. "That was just the beginning," Walter murmured. "The hard part comes now." Richard Thornton delivered his opening statement with the polished confidence of a man who had done this hundreds of times. He painted Catherine as a thief, a fraud, a woman who had built her empire on stolen ideas. He promised evidence, expert testimony, documentary proof. He was smooth and persuasive and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. Walter listened carefully, taking mental notes, looking for weaknesses. The first day of testimony was a gauntlet. Thornton called a parade of witnesses, technology analysts, industry experts, former employees of Prometheus Systems, all telling the same story of theft and deception. Walter cross-examined each one, probing for inconsistencies, challenging assumptions, planting seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. But he was operating at a disadvantage, and he knew it. He had no preparation time, no discovery materials, no expert witnesses of his own. He was improvising, relying on instincts honed over 40 years and knowledge of the law that he had maintained through 15 years of reading in public libraries during his days off. By the end of the day, when Judge Hayes adjourned the proceedings until the following morning, Walter was exhausted in a way he had not been since Elena's final months. Every muscle in his body ached. His mind felt stretched thin, overtaxed by the effort of processing so much information so quickly. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a spark of the man he used to be still alive after all these years. Catherine caught up with him in the hallway outside the courtroom after the reporters had finally been left behind. "Mr. Brennan," he turned. In the fluorescent light of the corridor, Catherine looked different than she had in the courtroom. Smaller, more vulnerable, the armor of her billion-dollar success stripped away by the events of the day. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did in there. I don't understand why you did it, but thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We've barely begun." "I know, but you stood up for me when no one else would. That means something." She hesitated. Can we talk more? Tonight, I have documents at my office, research materials, things that might help the case. I can't tonight. I have a shift. A shift? I'm still employed by the courthouse, Miss Ashford. If I miss my shift, I lose my job. Catherine stared at him, and Walter watched the understanding dawn in her eyes. The realization of the gulf between their worlds, the recognition that this man who had saved her in court still had to mop floors to pay his rent. Let me pay you, she said immediately. As my lawyer, a retainer, whatever the going rate is. No. Why not? Walter considered the question. Why not indeed? He could use the money. His apartment was barely habitable, his savings non-existent, his future as bleak as his past. But some things were more important than money. Because if I do this for money, I'm no different than the lawyers who betrayed you, he said finally. I'm doing this because it's right, because 15 years ago someone should have stood up for me and no one did. I won't let the same thing happen to you. Catherine was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. At least come to my place after your shift. We can go over the documents together, no matter how late it is. Walter nodded. Midnight, I'll be there. Midnight works. She gave him an address in Manhattan, a building in the financial district that Walter had walked past 1,000 times but never imagined entering. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into an elevator that would take her back to a world of luxury and privilege that had suddenly become a prison. Walter stood in the empty corridor for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. Then he retrieved his cleaning cart from the courtroom and went back to work. He had floors to mop. That night, after his shift ended at 11, Walter drove his 15-year-old Toyota Camry into Manhattan. The car had been Elena's purchase the year before she got sick, and he had kept it running through a combination of stubbornness and mechanical knowledge gained from a childhood watching his father maintain equipment on a coal miner's budget. Catherine's building was a glass tower that rose 40 stories into the night sky, its windows gleaming with the reflected lights of the city. The security guard in the lobby looked at Walter's maintenance uniform with undisguised skepticism, but a quick phone call to Catherine's penthouse got him past the velvet rope. The elevator ride to the top floor took nearly a minute, and when the doors opened, Walter found himself in a space that seemed designed by someone who had never known want. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Manhattan skyline. Modern art hung on walls that were themselves works of architectural beauty. The furniture was minimalist and clearly expensive, the kind of pieces that appeared in design magazines and cost more than most people's annual salaries. Catherine was waiting for him in what she called her study, a room that in any normal apartment would have been the master bedroom. She had changed out of her courtroom attire into jeans and a simple sweater, and she looked more human than she had all day. Coffee, she asked. Please. She poured from a machine that probably cost more than Walter's car, and the coffee was better than anything he had tasted in 15 years. Rich and smooth and completely unlike the bitter brew he made each morning in his tiny kitchen. Thank you for coming, Catherine said, settling into a chair across from him. I know this whole situation is unusual. Miss Ashford, the whole situation is more than unusual. It's orchestrated. And before we can figure out how to fight it, I need to understand everything. Not the version you told your lawyers, not the version for the media, the truth. Catherine took a deep breath, and then she began to talk. She started with the science explaining quantum computing in terms that Walter could follow despite his lack of technical background. She told him about the fundamental problem quantum bits or qubits that could exist in multiple states simultaneously, but were so sensitive to environmental interference that they required temperatures near absolute zero to function. She told him about the breakthrough that had made her famous, a way to use the instability itself as part of the computational process rather than fighting against it. Everyone said it was impossible. Catherine said, a note of pride creeping into her voice despite everything. My professors, my colleagues, the investors I pitched to, they all said I was wasting my time. But I knew I was right. I could see the solution in my head, even if I couldn't prove it yet. When did you first develop this approach? 2006. I was 24 years old, still a graduate student at MIT. I spent 6 years working on it, most of that time in a studio apartment that was smaller than this room. I lived on ramen noodles and coffee and the occasional pizza when I could afford it. I didn't have a lab, didn't have funding, didn't have anyone who believed in me except my parents. And you documented everything. Everything. Catherine stood and walked to a safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. She punched in a code and the door swung open, revealing stacks of folders and binders. These are my original research notes. Dated, notarized, witnessed. Every equation, every breakthrough, every failure. Proof that I developed this technology before Prometheus systems even existed. Walter took the folder she handed him and began flipping through the pages. What he saw was incomprehensible to him, pages of mathematical notation and scientific diagrams, but the dates were clear enough. 2006, 2007, 2008. Years before Prometheus had supposedly developed its own version of the technology. Why didn't your previous lawyers use this, he asked. They said it wasn't necessary. They said they had a better strategy. Walter felt the same cold fury he had felt in the courtroom, the recognition of betrayal so complete it could only be intentional. Miss Ashford not introducing this evidence wasn't a strategy, it was sabotage. Catherine's face went pale. You really think they were working against me? I don't think it. I know it. Walter closed the folder and looked up at her. Your lawyers were paid to lose. The only questions are who paid them and why. They worked through the night going over documents, reconstructing the timeline of events, looking for patterns. And the more they dug, the clearer the picture became. Every decision Catherine's legal team had made had weakened her case. Crucial evidence excluded. Key witnesses never deposed. Objections raised at moments that hurt the defense rather than helped it. It was not incompetence, it was systematic destruction. By 3 in the morning, Walter had a theory. This isn't just about your technology, he said, staring at the notes he had spread across Catherine's coffee table. It's about what your technology could do. What do you mean? Your quantum processing system has applications beyond computing. Energy storage, power conversion. Your own patents mention these possibilities. Walter looked up at her. If your technology works as advertised, it could revolutionize the energy industry. Make fossil fuels obsolete within a generation. Catherine nodded slowly. That's always been the long-term vision. Quantum-enhanced battery systems could be 10 times more efficient than anything we have now. And quantum optimization could transform the entire power grid. Which means, Walter continued, that you're not just a threat to some tech startup. You're a threat to every company that makes money from oil, coal, and natural gas. We're talking about an industry worth trillions of dollars. The realization hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. Prometheus Systems, Catherine whispered. It's not a real company, is it? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Walter stood gathering his notes. I need to go home and get some sleep before court tomorrow. But I want you to think about something. Is there anyone in your organization who might have been compromised? Anyone who had access to your systems who might have been feeding information to the other side? Catherine's face went through a series of emotions, denial, consideration, dawning horror. Diana Webb, she said quietly. My executive assistant. She's been with me for 5 years. She's the only person besides me who has full access to everything. Has she done anything unusual lately? Anything that seemed out of character? She copied files to a USB drive a few weeks ago. I asked her about it and she said it was for a backup. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Walter nodded grimly. We'll need to look into that, but carefully. If she is compromised, we don't want to tip her off. He gathered his jacket, the same maintenance uniform he had worn all day, and headed for the door. Catherine followed him. Mr. Brennan, she said as he waited for the elevator, why are you really doing this? You could have stayed invisible. You could have mopped your floors and collected your paycheck and let this be someone else's problem. Walter considered the question. The elevator doors opened and he stepped inside before turning to face her. 15 years ago, I was where you are now, alone, betrayed, facing enemies I couldn't see, and no one helped me. No one stood up and said, I will protect this person. I lost everything, my career, my reputation, my wife. His voice caught slightly on the last word, and he had to pause before continuing. I can't change what happened to me, but I can make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. The elevator doors began to close. Tomorrow in court, Walter added, whatever I say, whatever I do, don't react. Don't show surprise, don't contradict me. Everything will be part of a plan. What plan? I don't know yet. I'll figure it out tonight. The doors closed, cutting off Catherine's reply. Walter rode down 40 floors in silence, his mind already racing ahead to the battles to come. The night air of Manhattan was cold when he stepped out of the building, and his breath fogged in front of his face as he walked to his car. The Toyota started on the 3rd try. It always took 3 tries now. One of many small indignities of aging vehicles, and he began the long drive back to Queens. It was after 4 in the morning when Walter finally walked into his apartment. The space was exactly as he had left it, small spare containing only the essentials of a life stripped to its bones. One room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen, a bathroom down the hall shared with three other tenants, walls that he had never bothered to decorate except for two photographs that hung above the narrow bed where he slept alone every night. Elena's photograph. Their wedding day, her face radiant with joy, her white dress simple but beautiful in the dappled sunlight of Central Park. And Rachel's photograph, 5 years old, sitting in her mother's lap, smiling at the camera with eyes that had not yet learned to guard themselves against the world. Walter sat on the edge of his bed and looked at those photographs for a long moment. Tomorrow today really would bring new battles, new challenges. He needed sleep, needed rest, needed to prepare himself for what was coming. But first he needed to remember why he was doing this. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't stop working. Court in 5 hours. A case he was completely unprepared for. Opponents with unlimited resources and no scruples. A client who was counting on him to perform a miracle. He had done it before. He could do it again. But even as he told himself, this doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. He was 62 years old. He hadn't practiced law in 15 years. The rules had changed. The technology had changed. The world had changed. Was he really capable of going up against some of the best lawyers money could buy? There was only one way to find out. Walter set his alarm for 7 3 hours of sleep would have to be enough and lay back on the narrow bed. Outside his window, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the sky. Another day was coming. Another battle was about to begin. And for the first time in 15 years, Walter Brennan felt something stirring in his chest that he had almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. He fell asleep with Elena's photograph watching over him and dreamed of courtrooms and justice and the man he used to be. The alarm woke him too soon, dragging him from dreams he couldn't quite remember into a reality that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Walter showered in cold water. The hot water heater in his building was unreliable at best, and put on the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray two-piece that he had found at a thrift store the night before for $20. The suit was slightly too big, hanging loose on a frame that had been lean when it was purchased, and was leaner still after years of meals that prioritized economy over nutrition. But it was clean and pressed, and it transformed Walter from a maintenance worker into something that might, if you squinted, pass for a lawyer. He caught the subway into Manhattan, standing on the crowded train with his briefcase. Elena's old briefcase, another relic from a better time, clutched against his chest. The other passengers paid him no attention, lost in their phones and their newspapers and the private worlds inside their heads. Walter was invisible here too, just another anonymous face in a city of millions. But not for much longer. The courthouse was already buzzing when he arrived. Word of yesterday's drama had spread through the legal community like wildfire, and reporters were camped outside the main entrance, hungry for the next chapter of the story. They barely glanced at Walter as he entered to them. He was still the maintenance man, not yet recognized as the protagonist of the day's drama. Catherine was waiting for him outside courtroom 302. She looked better than she had the night before, though the shadows under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much either. "Ready?" she asked. "No," Walter admitted, "but let's do it anyway." The courtroom was even more packed than yesterday. Every seat was taken with the spectators standing along the walls and crowding into every available inch of space. When Walter entered, a murmur went through the crowd, people finally recognizing the janitor who had become a lawyer. He walked to the defense table with as much dignity as he could muster, ignoring the stares and whispers, focusing on the task ahead. Catherine took her seat beside him, and together they faced the front of the courtroom. Judge Hayes entered promptly at 9, and the trial resumed. Richard Thornton called his first witness of the day. Dr. Marcus Webb, introduced as one of the world's leading experts on quantum computing technology. Webb was a man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket that screamed academic respectability. He took the stand with the confidence of someone who had testified in dozens of trials and knew exactly how to present himself to a jury. For the next 30 minutes, Thornton walked Webb through his credentials and his analysis of the two technologies in question. The testimony was devastating. Webb claimed to have studied both systems extensively and concluded that Catherine's patents were derived from Prometheus's earlier research. The similarities are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental, Webb declared, looking directly at the jury. In my professional opinion, Miss Ashford's technology is a direct copy of work that was done at Prometheus Systems. Thornton smiled the satisfied smile of a lawyer who knew he was winning. No further questions, Your Honor. Mr. Brennan, Judge Hayes turned to the defense table. Your witness. Walter stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon him. This was the moment that would define everything. If he failed here, if he could not shake this expert witness, the trial was essentially over. He walked to the lectern, taking his time arranging his notes with deliberate care. Let them wait. Let the anticipation build. Dr. Webb, he began, his voice calm and conversational. You testified that you've been working with the Prometheus systems since 2019. Is that correct? That's correct. And you concluded that Miss Ashford's technology is derived from Prometheus's earlier research. Yes. Based on your examination of both systems. Exactly, the similarities are unmistakable. Walter nodded as if accepting this at face value. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. Dr. Webb, I have here the patent records for Miss Ashford's quantum processing technology. Would you please read the filing date? Webb looked at the document with a frown. September 12, 2008. 2008, Walter repeated. And when was Prometheus Systems founded? I believe it was 2016. So Miss Ashford filed her patents 8 years before Prometheus even existed. Walter turned to the jury. How exactly could she have copied research from a company that didn't exist when she did the work? A murmur went through the courtroom. Webb's face reddened. The original research at Prometheus predates the company's founding. Research done by whom? Walter interrupted. At what facility, funded by what organization? I don't have those details. You don't have those details. Walter let the words hang in the air. You're the prosecution's expert witness testifying that Miss Ashford stole technology, but you don't know where the supposedly stolen technology originated. Thornton rose. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. I'm questioning the basis of his testimony, Walter replied, which is entirely appropriate on cross-examination. Overruled, Judge Hayes said. You may continue, Mr. Brennan. Walter turned back to Webb. Dr. Webb, how much is Prometheus Systems paying you for your testimony today? Webb's face went from red to white. I'm being compensated for my time and expertise. How much? $250,000. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hayes banged her gavel for order, but even she looked surprised by the figure. $250,000, Walter said, for testimony that you cannot fully support with documented evidence. That's quite a payment for such limited expertise. I have documentation. Documentation provided by whom? By Prometheus Systems. By their lawyers. Have you independently verified any of it? Webb opened his mouth, then closed it again. The confidence had drained from his face, replaced by the expression of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on quicksand. No further questions, Your Honor. Walter returned to his seat. Catherine was staring at him with something approaching awe. How did you know, she whispered, about the payment? I didn't know, I guessed, but his reaction told me everything. The rest of the morning proceeded in a similar fashion. Thornton called witness after witness, and Walter picked each one apart, exposing inconsistencies, revealing financial connections, casting doubt on testimony that had seemed ironclad just hours before. It was not enough to win, not yet, but it was enough to shift the momentum. By the time Judge Hayes called for a lunch recess, the certainty that had characterized the prosecution's case was beginning to crack. Walter ate lunch alone in a corner of the courthouse cafeteria, the same cafeteria where he had eaten countless meals as a maintenance worker. The irony was not lost on him. Yesterday he had been invisible here, just another janitor among janitors. Today people pointed and whispered and gave him a wide berth, unsure what to make of him. He didn't mind the solitude. It gave him time to think, to plan, to prepare for what was coming next. His phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. When he opened it, he saw only 4 words. Be careful, they're watching. Walter stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it and pocketed his phone. If they were watching, let them watch. He had nothing left to hide. The afternoon session brought new challenges. Thornton, clearly rattled by the morning's setbacks, shifted his strategy. Instead of relying solely on expert testimony, he began introducing documentary evidence, emails, memos, internal communications that supposedly showed Catherine coordinating with Prometheus to steal their technology. Walter objected to each document, challenging authenticity, questioning chain of custody, forcing the prosecution to justify every piece of evidence. It was tedious work, the kind of procedural grinding that made no headlines, but could determine the outcome of a trial. Most of the documents were eventually admitted, but Walter's objections had planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. By 5 o'clock, when Judge Hayes adjourned for the day, Walter was running on fumes. His body ached. His mind was foggy with exhaustion, and he had eaten nothing since a sandwich at lunch that he could barely remember consuming. But he had survived another day. And more than survived, he had fought Prometheus to a standstill. Catherine found him in the hallway outside the courtroom. "That was incredible," she said. "The way you handled Webb, the way you challenged the documents, I've never seen anything like it." "Don't celebrate yet. We've won some battles, but the war is far from over." "I know. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I feel like maybe—" She stopped herself. "I don't want to jinx it." "Smart." Walter managed a tired smile. "I need to get back to my apartment and review some things. We should meet again tonight, go over strategy for tomorrow." "After your shift." Walter shook his head. "I talked to my supervisor today. Told him I needed some time off for personal reasons. He wasn't happy, but he agreed." "So you're free tonight?" "I'm free until this trial is over. One way or another." They agreed to meet at Catherine's penthouse at 8. Walter took the subway back to Queens, stopping at a grocery store to buy a cheap dinner that he could eat while working. His apartment seemed even smaller and shabbier than usual after spending time in Catherine's world of penthouse views and designer furniture. But it was his. The walls might be bare and the furniture secondhand and the heating unreliable, but it was the place where he had survived for 15 years, where he had kept himself together when everything else fell apart. He ate his dinner, a microwave meal that tasted like cardboard, and began reviewing his notes for the next day. The case was far from won. Thornton would come back stronger tomorrow with new strategies and new attacks. Walter needed to be ready. But as he worked, his mind kept drifting to questions that went beyond the immediate trial. Who was really behind Prometheus Systems? Why had Catherine's lawyers betrayed her? And why did this whole situation feel so familiar, like he was reliving something from his own past? The connection to Dominion Energy was there, hovering at the edge of his consciousness, but he couldn't quite grasp it. Not yet. At 7:30, Walter put on his jacket and headed out to meet Catherine. The subway was crowded with evening commuters heading home from work, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that somewhere in Manhattan, a battle was being fought that could affect all of them. Catherine's penthouse was warm and bright when he arrived, a stark contrast to the cold night outside. She had ordered food, real food, from a restaurant that probably charged more for a single meal than Walter spent on groceries in a week, and they ate together at her dining table while going over the case. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Catherine said between bites. "About Diana, about the possibility that she might be compromised. Have you noticed anything else unusual?" "I went back through some of our communications. There are small things, questions she asked that seemed innocent at the time but now feel different. Times when confidential information seemed to leak, even though only she and I had access." "Can you document this, create a timeline?" "Already started." Catherine pulled out a tablet and showed him a spreadsheet she had been working on. "I'm being careful, like you said. Not letting her know I suspect anything." Walter studied the timeline, his mind making connections. If she is feeding information to the other side, they know our strategy. They know what we're planning for tomorrow. Then how do we fight back? We don't tell her our real strategy. We feed her false information. Let her pass along things that will lead them in the wrong direction. Catherine nodded slowly. A trap. Exactly. They worked until midnight, developing a plan that was part legal strategy and part counterintelligence operation. Walter felt more alive than he had in years, his mind fully engaged in the kind of complex problem-solving that had once been his daily bread. But beneath the intellectual satisfaction, a darker current ran. The feeling that he was being drawn into something larger than a simple patent dispute. The suspicion that old enemies were involved, enemies he had thought he had escaped when he traded his lawyer's suit for a maintenance uniform. At midnight, Catherine offered him one of her guest rooms for the night, pointing out that it was too late to travel back to Queens and too important that he be rested for court tomorrow. Walter declined. "I'll sleep better in my own place," he said. "Even if it is a shoebox, at least let me have my driver take you." This, after a moment's hesitation, he accepted. The black sedan was impossibly comfortable compared to his aging Toyota, and Walter found himself drifting off during the drive, lulled by warmth and exhaustion. The driver woke him when they reached Queens, and Walter made his way upstairs to his apartment. He was asleep within minutes of lying down, too tired even to dream. But something woke him at 3 in the morning. A sound, a feeling, an instinct honed by years of living alone in a dangerous city. He lay still in the darkness, listening. The sound came again, a soft scraping at his door, like someone trying to work a lockpick. Walter moved silently, slipping out of bed, and reaching for the baseball bat he kept beside the nightstand. His heart was pounding, adrenaline burning away the fog of sleep. The door swung open. A figure stepped through, no two figures dressed in dark clothes, moving with the trained efficiency of professionals. Walter didn't wait to see what they wanted. He swung the bat with all his strength at the first figure's head. The blow connected with a satisfying crack, and the figure went down. The second one came at Walter fast, but years of mopping floors had kept his arms strong, and he swung again, catching the attacker in the ribs. The second figure staggered, then pulled something from a pocket, a knife gleaming in the dim light from the street outside. Walter backed up, bat raised, calculating his options. The first attacker was still down, groaning. The second was hurt, but still dangerous. And Walter was 62 years old in a confined space with nowhere to run. The figure with the knife lunged. Walter sidestepped, using the bat to deflect the blade, then brought it down hard on the attacker's extended arm. The knife clattered to the floor. The attacker screamed and fell back, clutching his arm. Lights were coming on in the hallway. Voices, neighbors woken by the commotion. The two attackers looked at each other, and some silent communication passed between them. Then they were moving, scrambling over each other to get out the door, disappearing into the night before anyone else could see them. Walter stood in his doorway, breathing hard, the baseball bat still raised. His neighbors emerged from their apartments, asking questions he couldn't fully process. Someone called the police. Someone else offered him water. But all Walter could think about was the message he had received earlier that day. Be careful, they're watching. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming after him. The game had changed. And Walter Brennan realized, standing in his ransacked apartment with blood on his baseball bat and fear in his heart, that this fight was about much more than a patent dispute. This was about survival. The police came and went, taking statements, promising to investigate, displaying the weary skepticism of officers who had seen too many crimes go unsolved. Walter told them what had happened, but left out his suspicions about who might be behind the attack. Those suspicions would sound paranoid without evidence, and evidence was something he would have to find himself. After the police left, Walter sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the chaos around him. His meager possessions had been scattered, drawers overturned, the few books he owned thrown from their shelves. It was not a random burglary. Nothing of value had been taken. This was a message, a warning, a demonstration of power. They know where you live. They can reach you anytime they want. But instead of fear, Walter felt something else rising in his chest. Anger, the cold, clean fury of a man who has been pushed too far and has nothing left to lose. They had taken his career. They had taken his wife indirectly by destroying his ability to care for her. They had taken 15 years of his life, reducing him to invisibility in the very place where he had once been someone. And now they were threatening to take whatever was left. Walter picked up the phone and called Catherine. They came for me tonight, he said when she answered, her voice groggy with sleep. Two men, professionals. What are you? I'm fine, they weren't. But this changes things. They're not just trying to win a lawsuit anymore. They're trying to eliminate the opposition. Silence on the other end. Then come here now. I have security, real security. You'll be safe. No. Walter's voice was firm. If I run, they win. If I hide, they win. The only way forward is through. Through what? Through them. Through this case. Through whatever it takes to expose the truth. He paused. But I need to know something. I need to know who we're really fighting. I don't understand. Prometheus Systems. The lawyers who betrayed you, the men who just tried to kill me, they're all connected. Someone is pulling the strings, someone with enough money and power to orchestrate all of this. I need to find out who. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then, I might be able to help. I have resources, investigators, researchers. If you tell me what to look for, I can have people start digging. Start with Prometheus Systems, corporate records, ownership structure, funding sources. Find out who really owns that company. And if it leads somewhere dangerous, Walter looked at the baseball bat still in his hand, streaked with blood from the night's encounter. Then we'll know what we're dealing with. He hung up and began cleaning his apartment, putting things back in order, erasing the evidence of the attack. The police would not solve this crime. They did not have the resources or the motivation to pursue powerful enemies. Justice, if it came at all, would have to come through other means. By the time the sun rose over Queens, Walter's apartment was restored to its usual sparse neatness. He showered, dressed in his courtroom suit, and made himself a cup of coffee in the same thermos Elena had given him all those years ago. Then he went to court. The third day of trial began with Thornton calling a new witness, a former employee of Ashford Technologies, who claimed to have seen Catherine accessing Prometheus Systems' proprietary databases. The testimony was detailed and damaging, painting a picture of systematic theft that would be difficult to counter. But Walter had been expecting something like this. He had spent his restless night preparing questions designed to expose the witness's credibility issues, financial problems that made him vulnerable to bribery, a grudge against Catherine for a missed promotion, connections to people associated with Prometheus. The cross-examination was brutal. By the time Walter was finished, the witness's story lay in tatters, and even Thornton looked shaken. "Your Honor," Walter said when the witness was dismissed. The defense moves to admit previously excluded evidence regarding Miss Ashford's original research documentation. Thornton was on his feet instantly. "Objection. This evidence was not included in discovery because Miss Ashford's previous counsel failed to disclose it. I have documentation showing that this evidence was provided to Harrison Monroe and Partners 8 months ago and was deliberately withheld from discovery materials." Judge Hayes's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Brennan. Do you have proof?" Walter produced a stack of papers from his briefcase. "I have records of the documents delivered to the previous counsel, signed receipts confirming their receipt, and evidence that these materials were never forwarded to the court as required. I submit that this represents misconduct serious enough to warrant investigation." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Thornton's face had gone pale. "I'll review these materials during the lunch recess," Judge Hayes said. "If Mr. Brennan's allegations are substantiated, the evidence will be admitted and appropriate action will be taken regarding the previous counsel's conduct." It was not yet a victory, but it was a crack in the wall, a crack that could widen into something much more significant. During the lunch break, Catherine found Walter in the same corner of the cafeteria where he had eaten alone the day before. "My people found something," she said, keeping her voice low as she sat across from him. "About Prometheus. About who really owns it. Tell me." "The ownership structure is layered. Shell companies within shell companies, offshore entities in the Caymans and Delaware and a dozen other places. But we traced it back, all the way back." Walter waited. "Dominion Energy Corporation." The name hit Walter like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Dominion Energy." His voice came out as a whisper. "You're certain?" "My investigators are some of the best in the business. They're certain." Walter sat back, his mind reeling. Dominion Energy, the company that had destroyed his career 15 years ago. The company that had killed James Whitmore and gotten away with it. The company that had turned him from a lawyer into a janitor. They were back. Or rather, they had never left. They had been there all along in the shadows, pulling strings, destroying lives. "There's more," Catherine said. "I don't know what it means, but 15 years ago there was a lawsuit against Dominion, a whistleblower case about safety violations at a nuclear plant. The lawyer who brought it was named Walter Brennan." Catherine's eyes widened. "That was you. That was me." Walter's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "They destroyed me to stop that case. And now they're trying to destroy you to stop yours. But why my technology has nothing to do with nuclear power? It has everything to do with power." Walter laughed bitterly at the double meaning. "Your technology threatens their entire business model. Quantum computing advances could revolutionize renewable energy, make fossil fuels obsolete. They're not trying to steal your technology, they're trying to eliminate it." Catherine stared at him, the full weight of their situation settling onto her shoulders. "This isn't just a lawsuit. This is war. It's always been war. We just didn't know who the enemy was." Walter stood. "But now we do. And that changes everything." He returned to the courtroom with a new fire burning in his chest. For 15 years he had accepted. His fate had made peace with his invisibility, had convinced himself that the past was past and nothing could be changed. But the past was not past. The past was hunting him. Hunting Catherine, hunting anyone who dared to challenge the power of those who saw human beings as obstacles to be eliminated. Walter Brennan was done running. It was time to fight. The afternoon session brought the moment Walter had been waiting for. Judge Hayes ruled that his evidence regarding the previous counsel's misconduct was sufficient to warrant admitting Catherine's original research documentation into the record. When the jury saw the dated notarized records proving that Catherine had developed her technology years before Prometheus existed, a visible shift occurred in their expressions. The prosecution's case, built on the foundation of Catherine being a thief, was crumbling. But Walter knew it was not enough. Winning this lawsuit would not stop Dominion Energy. They would find other ways to attack, other proxies to use. The only way to truly win was to expose the conspiracy behind the lawsuit, to drag the truth into the light where it could not be hidden. And for that, he needed more than courtroom victories. He needed evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. He needed witnesses willing to talk. He needed to break through the wall of money and power that Dominion had built around itself. The key, he realized, might be Diana Webb. If Catherine's assistant was feeding information to the enemy, she might also know things that could be useful. Not willingly, she was clearly acting under some form of coercion, but if the pressure could be shifted, if she could be made to see that her only way out was cooperation. That night, after court adjourned, Walter shared his plan with Catherine. "I want to confront her," Catherine said immediately. "Make her tell me the truth." "No, that would tip them off. We need to be subtle. Let her continue feeding them information, but only the information we want them to have. Meanwhile, we gather evidence of her communications with them. Build a case that she can't deny. And then we offer her a choice. Testify about who's really behind all this, or face prosecution for corporate espionage." Catherine was silent for a long moment. "She's been with me for 5 years. I trusted her." "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be right." Catherine's jaw set with determination. "Do what you have to do. I want these people exposed." The plan went into motion. Over the next several days while the trial continued, Walter and Catherine worked in parallel, presenting their case to the jury by day, building their trap by night. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the constant awareness that they were being watched. Walter changed his routes to the courthouse each day, varied his patterns, never stayed in the same place for long. He was not attacked again, but the threat hung over him like a storm cloud, a constant reminder of how far the enemy was willing to go. The breakthrough came on the 6th day of trial. Diana Webb showed up at Walter's apartment at 2 in the morning. She was shaking when he opened the door, pale, disheveled, clearly terrified. She looked nothing like the composed professional Walter had seen in photographs. "They're going to kill me," she said without preamble, "and you're the only one who can help." Walter let her in, checked the hallway to make sure she was alone, then closed and locked the door. "Talk," he said, and Diana talked. She told him everything. How she had been approached 6 months ago by a man who knew about a mistake she had made years before, an embezzlement that could have sent her to prison. How she had been coerced into copying documents, reporting on Catherine's strategies, feeding information to people she never met face to face. How the pressure had increased as the trial progressed, the demands becoming more extreme until finally she had overheard something that changed everything. "They're planning to kill her," Diana said, her voice breaking. "If the trial goes wrong, if they can't win in court, they're going to eliminate Catherine. Make it look like an accident. I heard them talking about it on a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear." Who was on the call? "A man named Garrett Shaw. I don't know exactly who he is, but he works for Dominion Energy. He's been the one giving me orders." Walter felt his heart rate spike. Evidence, real evidence, connecting Dominion directly to the conspiracy. "Did you record the call?" "No, but I kept records. Everything they asked me to do, every document I gave them, every communication. I was terrified, so I documented everything in case I ever needed proof that I was coerced." "Where are these records?" Diana reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive. "Everything's on here, and there's more." She looked Walter in the eye, and he saw something in her expression that he recognized, the desperation of someone who has done wrong and knows the only way out is the truth. "I made copies of their communications too. Emails, messages, phone records. I don't know how I got access. Maybe they got careless. Maybe their security wasn't as good as they thought. But I have evidence of the entire conspiracy. Not just against Catherine. Against you too." Walter's blood ran cold. "Against me. They have a whole file on you. What they did to you 15 years ago. How they fabricated the evidence that destroyed your career. They kept records of everything like they were proud of it." The room seemed to tilt around Walter. Proof after 15 years, proof that he had been framed. Proof that James Whitmore had been murdered. Proof that everything he had lost had been taken from him, deliberately, systematically, by people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can't live with this anymore. Because they're going to kill Catherine and maybe me too once they realize I know too much. Because," Diana's voice cracked, "because I've done terrible things, and this is the only way I can think of to make any of it right." Walter looked at the USB drive in her hand. Such a small thing to contain so much destruction and so much possibility. "If I take this," he said slowly, "your life will never be the same. You'll have to testify. You'll be exposed. Everything you've done will become public. I know. Diana pressed the drive into his hand. But at least I'll be able to live with myself. I couldn't do that before. Whatever happens now, at least I'll know I tried to make it right. Walter closed his fingers round the drive. In his palm, he held the key to everything, the evidence that could bring down Dominion energy, vindicate his own past, and protect Catherine from enemies who had been operating in the shadows for years. Thank you, he said, for having the courage to do this. Diana managed a weak smile. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. That's where bravery starts. He helped her arrange Safe Passage, a sister in Vermont, who could take her in a route that avoided the obvious exits from the city. By dawn, Diana was gone and Walter was left alone with the evidence that could change everything. He called Catherine first. I have it, he said when she answered. Everything we need. What do you mean? Evidence. Proof of the conspiracy. Enough to bring down Dominion energy and everyone connected to them. Silence on the other end. Then quietly, what do we do now? Walter looked out his window at the first light of dawn breaking over Queens. A new day was beginning. A new chapter in a story that had started 15 years ago when a young lawyer had tried to do the right thing and been destroyed for it. But this time would be different. This time he was not alone. This time he had evidence. And this time he was going to win. Now, Walter said, we finished this. The morning after Diana Webb vanished into the gray Vermont dawn, Walter Brennan sat in Catherine Ashford's penthouse with the USB drive before him on the glass coffee table, a small black rectangle containing enough digital dynamite to level corporate empires. The data specialist Catherine had hired worked through the night decrypting files and organizing the thousands of documents Diana had collected during her months as an unwilling double agent. What emerged from that digital excavation was more damning than either of them had imagined. The conspiracy stretched back nearly 2 decades. Dominion Energy had not simply targeted Catherine Ashford because her quantum technology threatened their fossil fuel dominance. They had been systematically eliminating threats for years, a pattern of destruction that included Walter's own case and at least 7 others that the investigators could identify. Scientists whose research challenged petroleum interests, journalists who dug too deep into environmental violations, whistleblowers who tried to expose safety hazards. Each one had been neutralized through the same playbook: fabricated evidence, corrupted legal teams' character assassination, and when necessary accidents that were never quite investigated thoroughly enough. Walter read through the files with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of vindication. There it was in black and white, the emails coordinating the theft of evidence from his office, the payments to the experts who had testified against him, the instructions to plant falsified documents that would destroy his reputation. James Whitmore's death was there too, discussed in clinical terms as a necessary solution to a problematic witness, the murder disguised as suicide with the casual efficiency of people who had done such things before. Catherine found him still reading at 7 in the morning, his coffee cold and untouched beside him. You haven't slept, she observed, settling into the chair across from him. Walter looked up, and Catherine saw something in his eyes she had not seen before: tears. Not flowing, but present, glistening at the edges, held back by the will of a man who had taught himself long ago that weeping was a luxury he could not afford. My wife died believing I was innocent. Walter said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer fully suppress. But she never got to see the proof. She never got to see them exposed for what they did to us. Catherine did not offer empty comfort or meaningless platitudes. She simply sat with him in the silence, honoring the magnitude of what he was feeling, understanding that some griefs were too deep for words. After a long moment, Walter drew a breath and straightened in his chair. The tears retreated, replaced by the steel that had carried him through 15 years of invisibility. We need to decide how to use this, he said, gesturing at the files spread across the table. The trial is one thing, but this is bigger than the trial. This is evidence of criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, possibly murder. We need to involve federal authorities. The FBI, eventually, but we have to be careful. Dominion has connections everywhere. If we approach the wrong people, this evidence could disappear, just like the evidence in my case disappeared 15 years ago. Catherine nodded slowly. I know someone. Thomas Chen, an agent in the white-collar crime division. He investigated some irregularities in my industry a few years ago. He seemed honest. Seemed honest isn't good enough. We need certainty. Then we test him. Give him a piece of the evidence, something significant, but not everything. See what he does with it. It was a risk, but every path forward carried risks. Walter agreed and Catherine made the call. The trial resumed that morning with Richard Thornton visibly rattled. Word had spread through legal circles about Diana Webb's disappearance, about the evidence that might exist about the possibility that the Ashford case was about to explode into something much larger. Thornton's confidence, once so unshakable, had developed cracks that Walter intended to widen into chasms. The prosecution's case was in shambles. With Catherine's original research documentation now admitted into evidence, the narrative of theft had become impossible to sustain. Thornton tried to pivot, suggesting that perhaps Catherine had developed the technology independently, but had still engaged in corporate espionage to access Prometheus's implementation methods. It was a desperate maneuver, and the jury's expressions suggested they were not buying it. Walter's cross-examinations grew more aggressive, each question designed not just to undermine testimony, but to hint at the larger conspiracy waiting to be revealed. He could not yet introduce the evidence from Diana's files that would require proper authentication and would tip off Dominion that their spy had turned, but he could plant seeds of doubt that would flower when the full truth emerged. On the 8th day of trial, during a lunch recess, Walter's phone rang with a number he had not seen in months. Rachel. His daughter's name on the screen sent a jolt through his chest. Their last conversation had been brief and uncomfortable, a birthday call that lasted less than 5 minutes before Rachel made excuses about work commitments. The distance between them had grown so vast that Walter sometimes wondered if it could ever be bridged. He answered on the third ring, stepping into an empty corridor for privacy. Rachel. Dad? Her voice was different than he remembered, not hostile but uncertain, as if she were navigating unfamiliar territory. I saw you on the news. The trial. The trial, the whole story about the janitor who became a lawyer again, it's everywhere. Walter leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted by more than just the demands of the courtroom. I should have called you, told you what was happening before you saw it on television. Why didn't you? The question hung between them, carrying the weight of years of silence and distance. Because I didn't know if you would care, Walter admitted. Because every time we talk, I can hear how disappointed you are in me. Because I've spent 15 years trying to accept that I lost my daughter, along with everything else, and I didn't want to give myself false hope. Silence on the other end. When Rachel spoke again, her voice had changed, softer now, stripped of the defensive edge that had characterized their conversations for so long. I'm not disappointed in you, Dad. I never was. Then what? I was angry and scared, and I didn't know how to deal with any of it, so I just pulled away. Rachel's breath caught. When Mom died, I blamed you. Not because it was your fault, but because I needed someone to blame, and you were there. And then you just gave up. You stopped being a lawyer, stopped fighting, became this ghost of the person I remembered. I didn't know how to reach you anymore. Walter closed his eyes, feeling the truth of her words cut through defenses he had built over years. I didn't give up. I survived. There's a difference, but I understand why it looked the same from the outside. I know that now. Watching you in that courtroom, standing up for that woman when no one else would. Dad, that's the person I remember from when I was a kid. The person who would fight for anyone who needed help, no matter what it cost him. That person never went away, Rachel. He just got buried under a lot of rubble. I want to see you, Rachel said abruptly. Not on a screen, not through news coverage. I want to come to New York. I want to be there for the rest of the trial. Walter's heart clenched. You don't have to do that. I know you have work responsibilities. None of that matters. You're my father, and I've wasted too many years pretending that wasn't important. She paused. I already booked a flight. I land tomorrow morning. He did not trust himself to speak. After a moment, Rachel continued. I love you, Dad. I should have said that more. I should have said it every time we talked instead of hiding behind small talk and excuses. But I'm saying it now. I love you and I'm proud of you, and I want to be there when you win this case. What makes you think I'll win? Because you're Walter Brennan, and Walter Brennan doesn't lose fights that matter. The call ended, and Walter stood alone in the empty corridor, tears finally falling freely down his weathered cheeks. He had lost so much: his career, his wife, his place in the world, but perhaps not everything was gone forever. Perhaps some broken things could still be mended. Rachel arrived the next morning, looking older than Walter remembered, the years of distance visible in the new lines around her eyes and the gray beginning to streak her dark hair. She found him outside the courthouse, and for a moment they simply stood facing each other, two people who had forgotten how to be father and daughter, trying to remember. Then Rachel stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and Walter held his daughter for the first time in years, and the world seemed a little less broken than it had been before. I'm sorry, Rachel whispered against his shoulder, for all the time we lost. We have time now, Walter replied. That's what matters. They walked into the courthouse together, and if the reporters noticed the change in Walter Brennan, the lighter step, the brighter eyes, the subtle smile that played at the corners of his mouth, they attributed it to confidence about the trial rather than the healing of wounds far older and deeper than any lawsuit. The trial's ninth day brought unexpected developments. FBI agent Thomas Chen had received the test evidence Catherine provided and responded not with suppression, but with intense interest. He requested a meeting off the record away from official channels to discuss what else might exist. Walter and Catherine met him in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, chosen for its anonymity and its distance from the federal buildings where Dominion might have eyes. Chen was younger than Walter expected, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and the controlled demeanor of someone who had learned to hide his reactions. The documents you provided are authentic, Chen said without preamble. Our forensic team verified the digital signatures. If you have more material of similar quality, we're looking at one of the largest corporate conspiracy cases in American history. We have more, Walter confirmed. Much more. But we need guarantees. The last time evidence like this existed, it disappeared from my office and was replaced with fabrications. We can't risk that happening again. I understand your concerns. Dominion has connections, and some of those connections reach into law enforcement, but they don't reach everywhere. Chen leaned forward. I've been investigating this company for 3 years, following threads that kept going cold. Every witness who might have talked either changed their story or had unfortunate accidents. Every document that might have been useful was lost or corrupted. I started to think I was chasing shadows. You weren't, Catherine said. The shadows were real. They just had very powerful people protecting them. Which is why I need your evidence, and why I'm willing to take extraordinary measures to protect it. Chen pulled out a card and slid it across the table. There's a secure facility we use for sensitive materials. Everything there is isolated from normal bureau networks, accessible only to a small team I've personally vetted. If you're willing to trust me, I can guarantee your evidence will be preserved and protected until we're ready to move. Walter studied the agent's face, looking for signs of deception, the subtle tells that years of courtroom experience had taught him to recognize. He found none. Why should we trust you? Because I have my own reasons for wanting Dominion brought down, Chen replied, his voice dropping. 8 years ago, my brother was an engineer at one of their facilities. He found evidence of environmental violations, tried to report them through proper channels, and was told to keep quiet if he wanted to keep his job. He kept pushing anyway. 3 months later, he died in a single car accident on a road he had driven 1,000 times without incident. The agent's face remained controlled, but Walter could see the pain beneath the professional mask. The investigation concluded it was driver error. I never believed it. But I couldn't prove anything. The evidence was always just out of reach. The witnesses always changed their stories. The documents were always corrupted or missing. Chen met Walter's eyes. You have a chance to do what I've been trying to do for almost a decade. Expose these people, make them pay for what they've done. I want to help you do that. Walter made his decision. Tomorrow, he said, after court, we'll bring everything. The handover of evidence took place in a warehouse in New Jersey that had been converted into a secure facility, its nondescript exterior hiding layers of electronic security and physical barriers. Rachel came with them, insisting on being present, wanting to see the proof of what had been done to her family with her own eyes. She read through the files in silence, her face growing paler with each page. The clinical discussions of how to destroy her father's career. The calculations of how much it would cost to fabricate evidence convincingly. The dismissive references to collateral damage that included her mother's illness, as if Elena Brennan's suffering had been merely an inconvenient side effect rather than a human tragedy. They killed her, Rachel said finally, her voice hollow. Not directly, but they killed her. If Dad hadn't lost his job, if we hadn't lost the house and the insurance, she might have... We don't know that, Walter interrupted gently. Cancer doesn't care about money or circumstances. But treatment does. The best doctors, the newest therapies, we couldn't afford any of it after they destroyed you. She might have had a chance. Walter had no answer for that. It was a question he had asked himself countless times in the years since Elena's death, a wound that would never fully heal. All he could do was put his arm around his daughter and hold her while she wept for the mother she had lost and the father who had been taken from her long before he died. Chen's team began processing the evidence, immediately working around the clock, to verify authenticity and build a case that would withstand the legal challenges Dominion would inevitably mount. The FBI agent kept Walter informed of their progress, and with each passing day, the picture grew more complete and more damning. But Dominion was not passive. The attacks began subtly at first. Catherine's company stock started dropping on rumors planted by anonymous sources. Negative stories about Walter appeared in tabloid publications rehashing the old accusations with new embellishments. Witnesses scheduled to testify in the trial received visits from intimidating strangers who suggested their memories might be unreliable. Then the attacks escalated. A car tried to run Catherine off the road on her way to the courthouse. The driver was never identified. Walter's apartment was broken into, again this time more thoroughly, with clear evidence of professional surveillance equipment being installed. Rachel received threatening phone calls at her hotel voices that knew details about her life they should not have known. "They know we have the evidence," Walter said at an emergency meeting in Catherine's penthouse. "They're trying to intimidate us into backing down. Or eliminate us before we can use it," Catherine added grimly. Chen had come to the meeting, his face tight with concern. "We're accelerating our timeline. The grand jury can be convened within the week. But until then, you're all in danger." "What do you suggest?" "I suggest you disappear, all of you. We have safe houses." "No." Walter's voice was firm. "If we disappear, they win. The trial is still ongoing. If I don't show up in court tomorrow, the judge will have grounds to dismiss. Everything we've worked for will be lost. The trial can be postponed, and give them time to regroup, to destroy more evidence, to silence more witnesses." Walter shook his head. "We finish the trial, we present our evidence, we win in court, and we win with the FBI. We don't give them an inch." Catherine looked at him with something approaching wonder. "You really aren't afraid of them?" "I was afraid for 15 years. Fear kept me invisible, kept me mopping floors, kept me from being the person I used to be. I'm done being afraid." Walter turned to Chen. "What we need isn't a safe house. What we need is security. Real security enough to keep us safe while we finish what we started." The security arrived within hours. Not FBI agents who would have attracted too much attention, but private contractors vetted by Chen's team. They established a perimeter around Catherine's building, swept for surveillance devices, and set up protocols for movement between the penthouse and the courthouse. Rachel refused to leave. "I just found my way back to you," she told Walter when he suggested she return to San Francisco. "I'm not leaving again. Whatever happens, we face it together. It's dangerous." "I know, I don't care." Walter saw in his daughter's eyes the same stubborn determination that had driven him through 40 years of fighting for justice. The Brennan blood ran true. "All right," he conceded. "Together then." The trial's final days were a symphony of legal warfare. Walter presented Catherine's original research documentation, walking the jury through the timeline that proved she had developed her technology years before Prometheus existed. He called expert witnesses who demolished the prosecution's claims with technical precision. He introduced the evidence of the previous counsel's misconduct, painting a picture of systematic sabotage that extended far beyond simple negligence. Richard Thornton fought back with everything he had, but his arsenal was depleted. His witnesses had been discredited, his documents challenged, his narrative of theft shattered beyond repair. By the time closing arguments arrived, even the most skeptical observers could see which way the verdict was likely to fall. Walter delivered his closing argument on a Tuesday afternoon, standing before the jury with 15 years of pain and hope compressed into his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case was never really about patent infringement or intellectual property. It was about power. The power of wealthy corporations to crush anyone who threatens their interests. The power to buy lawyers and experts and witnesses. The power to manufacture lies and call them evidence." He paused, letting his gaze move across the 12 faces that would decide Catherine Ashford's fate. Catherine Ashford built something remarkable. She took an idea that everyone said was impossible and made it real through years of dedication and sacrifice. And for that, she was targeted. Not by competitors who wanted to innovate, but by forces that wanted to destroy innovation itself. Walter walked slowly before the jury box, his words measured and precise. "You have seen the evidence. You have heard the testimony. You know the truth. Catherine Ashford created this technology. It belongs to her. The only theft in this case was the attempt to steal it from her through a corrupted legal system." He stopped, turning to face the jury directly. "I am asking you to do something that sounds simple but is actually profound. Reject the lies. Side with the truth. Send a message that justice cannot be bought, that wealth does not equal righteousness, that ordinary people sitting in judgment can see through the machinations of the powerful. Walter's voice dropped intimate now as if speaking to each juror individually. I have spent 15 years as an invisible man cleaning the floors of this courthouse, watching justice unfold and watching it fail. I have seen good people destroyed and guilty people walk free. I know how the system can be corrupted. He straightened his voice, rising again. But I also know this, the system only fails when good people allow it to fail. You are the last line of defense against injustice. You have the power to do what is right. I am asking you to use it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with a verdict of not guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, spectators cheered. Catherine wept with relief, clutching Walter's arm, as if afraid the moment might dissolve if she let go. But Walter knew the celebration was premature. The trial was won, but the larger battle was just beginning. 3 days later, FBI agents executed simultaneous raids on Dominion Energy headquarters, Prometheus Systems offices, and the homes of a dozen executives and operatives. The evidence from Diana Webb's files had been supplemented by Chen's team, creating a case so comprehensive that even Dominion's army of lawyers could not find holes in it. The charges included conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and most significantly, 3 counts of murder in connection with deaths that had previously been ruled accidents or suicides. James Whitmore's name was on the indictment, finally receiving the justice that had been denied for 15 years. Walter watched the news coverage from Catherine's penthouse, Rachel beside him, the 3 of them united by circumstances none of them could have predicted. "It's over," Catherine said softly, watching footage of executives being led away in handcuffs. "Not over," Walter corrected. "The trials will take years. The appeals will take longer. Some of them will probably walk despite everything. But the truth is out. That matters." "Yes." Walter allowed himself a small smile. "That matters." His phone buzzed with a text message from Chen Garrett Shaw in custody. "He's talking. Says he'll testify against everyone in exchange for consideration." Walter read the message aloud, and something loosened in his chest that had been tight for 15 years. "Shaw was the one who coordinated the operation against me," he explained. "If he testifies, if he tells everything he knows, the whole conspiracy comes down. Not just Dominion, but everyone they paid, everyone who helped them, everyone who looked the other way." Rachel reached over and took her father's hand. "Mom would be proud of you." "I hope so. I spent 15 years wondering if I had let her down by accepting defeat, by becoming invisible, by stopping the fight." "You never stopped fighting," Catherine said. "You just fought differently. You survived. You kept your integrity. You stayed ready for the moment when you could fight again." Walter thought about Elena, about the promise he had made to her in those final days. "Stay good, stay kind, be the man I fell in love with." He had kept that promise. Through all the years of emptiness and invisibility, through all the nights of doubt and despair, he had remained who he was. And when the moment came, when a woman needed someone to stand up for her, in a courtroom full of people who saw her as prey, he had been ready. "There's something else," Walter said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a piece of paper folded and worn from handling. "I've been thinking about what comes next, after everything settles." "What do you mean?" Walter unfolded the paper, revealing a sketch of a simple storefront with words above the door, "Brennan Legal Aid." "All those years in the courthouse, I watched lawyers help people who could afford them and ignore people who couldn't. I want to change that. A legal aid office, free services for workers who need representation but can't pay. The people my father would have needed if someone like me had existed when he was dying of black lung." Catherine studied the sketch with growing interest. "You would need funding, staff, office space." "I know, it's probably just a dream." "Dreams are where change begins." Catherine smiled. "What if I told you I've been thinking about creating a foundation, something to give back to help people who face the kind of injustice I faced, but don't have billions of dollars to fight it?" Walter looked at her, hope flickering in his chest. "You would do that?" "I would do more than that. I would fund your legal aid office. I would find others to support it. I would help you build something that could make a real difference, not just for one person, but for thousands." Rachel squeezed her father's hand. "I want to help too. I've been thinking about going to law school, continuing what you started." "You would give up your career in tech. I would find something more meaningful than helping companies optimize their advertising algorithms." Rachel's eyes shone with a fire. Walter recognized the same fire that had burned in him at her age, the same fire Elena had loved. I want to be like you, Dad. I want to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Walter looked at his daughter, at Catherine, at the sketch of a dream he had barely dared to imagine. The losses of the past 15 years would never be erased. Elena was gone. The years of invisibility could not be recovered. The pain of what had been done to him would always leave scars. But from the wreckage, something new was emerging. A daughter returned, a mission renewed, a future that held purpose instead of mere survival. All right, Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. Let's build something together. Outside the penthouse windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the city below, FBI agents were still executing warrants, still gathering evidence, still dismantling the conspiracy that had shadowed so many lives. The battle was not over. It would not be over for years. But for the first time in 15 years, Walter Brennan looked at the future and saw light instead of darkness. The weeks following the FBI raids unfolded with the relentless momentum of an avalanche. Dominion Energy's stock plummeted 40% in the first 3 days, wiping out billions in market value and sending shockwaves through the energy sector. Board members resigned in rapid succession, each departure accompanied by carefully worded statements expressing shock at allegations they claimed to know nothing about. The company's CEO, a silver-haired man named Harold Weston, who had built his reputation on philanthropy and environmental responsibility, was photographed being escorted from his Connecticut mansion in handcuffs at 6 in the morning, his face a mask of disbelief that his empire of carefully constructed lies had finally crumbled. Walter watched the coverage with a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. For 15 years he had imagined this moment, dreamed of seeing the people who destroyed his life brought to justice. But the reality felt different than the fantasy. There was no surge of triumph, no sense of vindication washing away the years of pain. There was only a quiet acknowledgement that justice, when it finally arrived, could not undo what had been done. Elena was still gone. The years of invisibility could not be recovered. The man he might have become without their interference would forever remain a ghost of possibility. Rachel found him on Catherine's balcony one evening, staring out at the city lights, with an expression she could not quite read. "You look like somebody who won the lottery but lost the ticket," she observed, settling into the chair beside him. Walter managed a small smile at her characterization. "I spent 15 years wanting this. Now that it's happening, I realize I wanted something that doesn't exist. I wanted the past to be different. Justice can't give me that." "No, but it can give you the future." Walter turned to look at his daughter, struck again by how much she had grown in the years of their estrangement, how much she resembled Elena in the way she held her head, in the directness of her gaze. "Your mother used to say something like that. She would tell me not to waste energy mourning what couldn't be changed. Focus on what you can still build," she would say. "The past is a lesson, not a prison." She was wise. She was everything. Walter's voice caught slightly on the words. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Did you keep the promise you made to her?" "I tried. Some days were harder than others. There were times when the anger felt like it would consume me, times when I wanted to burn the world down for what they had done to us. But I would remember her face, remember the way she looked at me in those last days, and I would find a way to let the anger go." That's why you helped Catherine. Not just because it was right, but because it was what Mom would have wanted. Walter nodded slowly, the truth of his daughter's words settling into his bones. "I think so. When I stood up in that courtroom, I wasn't thinking about revenge or vindication. I was thinking about a woman who needed help and had no one else. Your mother would have wanted me to be that person." They sat together in companionable silence as the city hummed below them, father and daughter, reconnecting across the chasm of lost years. The distance between them had not fully closed, might never fully close, but it was narrowing with each conversation, each shared meal, each moment of simply being present with one another. The grand jury handed down indictments 3 weeks after the raids, a cascade of charges that read like a catalog of corporate criminality: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and most significantly, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in connection with deaths that had been disguised as accidents or suicides for years. Garrett Shaw, the operative who had coordinated Dominion's dirty work for over a decade, proved to be the prosecution's greatest asset. Faced with the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, he chose cooperation over loyalty, providing testimony that connected the company's executive leadership directly to the criminal conspiracy. His detailed accounts of how evidence had been fabricated against Walter, how James Whitmore had been eliminated, how Catherine's legal team had been corrupted, filled hundreds of pages of depositions that would form the backbone of the government's case. Walter was called to testify before the grand jury on a gray November morning, 15 years and 7 months after the day his life had been destroyed. The federal building where the grand jury convened was familiar to him in ways both painful and profound. He had argued cases in these halls as a young lawyer, had walked these corridors with the confident stride of a man who believed in the system's capacity for justice. Later, he had cleaned these floors as a janitor, invisible, and forgotten a ghost haunting the scene of his own destruction. Now he returned as neither lawyer nor janitor, but as a witness, a survivor, a man who had outlasted those who tried to erase him. The grand jury room was smaller than he expected, a windowless space filled with 23 citizens who would decide whether the evidence justified criminal charges. Walter took his seat at the witness table and looked out at their faces, ordinary people performing an extraordinary civic duty, and felt a sudden kinship with them. They were not so different from the juries he had addressed throughout his career. People trying to understand complex situations and render fair judgments. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Sarah Blackwood, who had been appointed to lead the Dominion investigation, guided Walter through his testimony with methodical precision. She asked about his career before the destruction, about the Whitmore case, about the night his evidence disappeared, and the fabricated documents that replaced it. She asked about the years of suspension and the struggle to clear his name, about Elena's illness and death, about the life he had been forced to build from the wreckage. Walter answered each question carefully, his lawyer's instincts guiding him even after 15 years away from practice. He kept his emotions contained, his statements precise, his narrative clear and compelling. But when Blackwood asked him to describe the moment he realized his career had been deliberately destroyed, something broke loose inside him. "I knew from the beginning that I had been framed." Walter said, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of suppressed pain. "The evidence against me was too perfect, too convenient, too precisely designed to destroy everything I had built. But knowing and proving are different things. I spent 4 years fighting to clear my name, and even after I succeeded, the damage was done. My reputation was ruined. My wife was sick, and we could not afford the best treatment. My daughter grew up watching her father reduced from someone who mattered to someone who cleaned floors for minimum wage." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "The worst part was not what they did to me. The worst part was what they did to James Whitmore. He came to me because he believed I could help him, believed I could expose the truth and protect him from retaliation. Instead, they killed him and made it look like suicide, and I could do nothing to stop it or avenge him. For 15 years, I carried that guilt, the knowledge that a man died because he trusted me." The grand jury room was utterly silent. Walter looked at the faces before him and saw his own pain reflected in their expressions, saw the dawning understanding of what he had endured and what it had cost him. "I am not here seeking revenge," Walter concluded. "Revenge would not bring back James Whitmore or my wife or the years I lost. I am here because the truth matters, because justice delayed is still justice, because the people who did these things need to face consequences, not for my sake, but for the sake of everyone else they might target if they are allowed to continue operating in the shadows." The indictments came down the following week, and the trials began 3 months later. Walter did not attend most of the proceedings. He had given his testimony, provided his evidence, played his part in the machinery of justice. Now he focused on building something new, something that would honor Elena's memory and fulfill the promise he had made to his father's grave so many decades ago. Brennan Legal Aid opened its doors on a cold February morning, occupying a modest storefront in Brooklyn that had previously housed a dry cleaning business. The space was small and the furnishings were secondhand, but Walter had insisted on 2 things: a conference room large enough to meet with multiple clients at once, and a waiting area with comfortable chairs where people could sit without feeling like they were intruding. Catherine had been true to her word about funding. The Ashford Foundation for Justice, established with a $20 million initial endowment, would support legal aid services across the country, with Brennan Legal Aid as its flagship project. The foundation had also recruited pro bono support from law firms that wanted to burnish their reputations in the wake of the Dominion scandal, providing Walter with a network of volunteer attorneys who could handle cases beyond his capacity. Rachel had enrolled in law school, attending evening classes at Fordham while working at the legal aid office during the day. She started as an office manager, handling paperwork and scheduling, and the thousand small tasks that kept an organization running, but Walter could see her mind working on the legal problems that crossed his desk, could see her developing the instincts that would one day make her an effective advocate. "Your first client is here," Rachel announced one morning, poking her head into Walter's cramped office. "A factory worker named Miguel Santos says he was fired after reporting safety violations." Walter felt a chill run down his spine at the familiar pattern. History did not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymed. Miguel Santos was a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and worried eyes. He sat across from Walter's desk and told a story that echoed through the decades, a story of a company that valued profits over people and punished anyone who threatened to expose the truth. "They said I was let go for performance issues." Miguel explained, his English accented but clear. "But everyone knows the real reason. I filed 3 complaints about the chemical storage. The containers were leaking, the ventilation was broken, people were getting sick. Management did nothing except tell me to mind my own business." "Do you have documentation? The complaints you filed, any evidence of the unsafe conditions?" "I have photos on my phone. I have copies of the complaints. I have names of coworkers who can confirm what I'm telling you." Miguel leaned forward, his expression desperate. "Mr. Brennan, I have a family. My wife, 3 kids. Without this job, I don't know how we're going to survive. But I couldn't stay quiet while people were getting hurt. It wouldn't have been right." Walter looked at this man, this ordinary worker who had done an extraordinary thing, and saw his father, saw James Whitmore, saw all the invisible people he had sworn to protect and had failed and was now being given a chance to protect again. "Mr. Santos, I want you to understand something. Taking on your former employer will not be easy. They have lawyers, resources, time on their side. The process will be long and stressful, and there are no guarantees of success." Miguel nodded soberly. "I know, but if I don't fight, they win. And if they win, nothing changes. Someone else reports a problem, they get fired too. More people get sick. Maybe someone dies." He met Walter's eyes with a fierce determination. "My father worked in fields where they sprayed pesticides and nobody cared about safety. He died of cancer when I was 20. I won't let that happen to my coworkers if there's anything I can do to stop it." Walter extended his hand across the desk. "Then let's stop it together." The Santos case became the first of many that Brennan Legal Aid would handle in its opening year. Word spread through immigrant communities and working-class neighborhoods that there was a lawyer in Brooklyn who would fight for people who could not afford to fight for themselves, a lawyer who did not care about their ability to pay, who only cared about whether their cause was just. They came with stories of wage theft and workplace injuries, of discrimination and harassment, of employers who treated them as expendable resources rather than human beings. Walter took every case he could, working 12-hour days training Rachel and the volunteer attorneys in the tactics and strategies he had developed over 40 years of practice. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it filled a void that had been empty for 15 years. Catherine visited the office regularly, bringing coffee and encouragement and the occasional strategic insight from her experience navigating corporate politics. Her presence had become a fixture in Walter's life, a friendship forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal and deepened by mutual respect and understanding. One evening, after a particularly difficult day spent comforting a client whose case had been dismissed on a technicality, Catherine found Walter alone in the conference room, staring at the wall of photographs that documented the people they had helped. "You're brooding," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "Reflecting, there's a difference. The Rodriguez case. 11 months of work, and it all collapsed because of a filing deadline that was missed before I took over the case. The previous attorney malpracticed the whole thing, and there's nothing I can do to fix it." "You can't win them all, Walter." "I know, but every loss represents a real person with real problems that won't be solved. Mrs. Rodriguez worked at that company for 15 years, and they denied her pension because of a technicality in the paperwork. She deserved better than what the system gave her." Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Do you remember what you told me the night Diana Webb came to your apartment with the evidence? You said you were doing this because it was right. Because 15 years ago, no one stood up for you, and you wouldn't let the same thing happen to someone else." "I remember." You stood up for Mrs. Rodriguez. You fought for her for 11 months. The fact that you lost doesn't erase that. It doesn't diminish what you did or what you tried to do. Catherine leaned forward, her blue eyes intent. You taught me something important during the trial. You taught me that the outcome doesn't define the effort. Sometimes you do everything right and still lose. That doesn't mean you were wrong to treat Walter looked at her, this woman who had entered his life as a desperate client and become something more, something he had not expected and still did not quite know how to name. Their relationship had evolved beyond lawyer and client, beyond allies, in a common struggle, into a friendship marked by mutual admiration and a comfort in each other's presence that neither of them had anticipated. Elena used to say something similar, Walter admitted. She would tell me that the fight was the point, not the victory. That standing up for what's right has value regardless of whether you win. She sounds like she was remarkable. She was. I spent 15 years trying to honor her memory, trying to keep the promise I made to her. Sometimes I wondered if I was succeeding or just going through the motions. He paused, his gaze returning to the photographs on the wall. I think she would be proud of this. The office, the work, Rachel coming back and going to law school. I think this is what she wanted for me, even if she never got to see it. She sees it. Catherine's voice was soft but certain. Wherever she is, whatever form that takes, she sees what you've built, and she's proud. They sat together in the gathering darkness as the city lights flickered on outside the window. Two people who had found in each other something neither had been looking for. Whatever their relationship might become, if it became anything beyond what it already was, would unfold in its own time. They were both too wise to rush, too scarred by loss to take connection for granted. 6 months after the office opened, Walter received a call that would close the final chapter of his 15-year ordeal. The Dominion Energy trials had been proceeding through the federal court system, and now the prosecution was preparing for the main event, the trial of Harold Weston and 5 other executives on charges including conspiracy to commit murder. Walter was asked to testify, not as a victim this time, but as an expert witness who could explain the full scope of the conspiracy and its human cost. The trial was held in the same federal courthouse where Walter had worked as a janitor for 15 years. He walked through the familiar halls with Rachel beside him, past the maintenance closets where he had stored his supplies, past the courtrooms where he had watched justice unfold, and fell past the spots where he had mopped countless gallons of dirty water from marble floors. Strange being back here, Rachel observed, sensing his mood. Beyond strange. I cleaned that bathroom for 7 years. Walter gestured toward a door they were passing. Every morning before the judges arrived, I would mop the floor and think about the cases that would be decided that day. Wondered if any of them mattered. Wondered if I would ever matter again. You matter, Dad. You always mattered. Walter squeezed his daughter's hand, grateful for her presence, grateful that the distance between them had finally been bridged. The courtroom was packed for his testimony, journalists and spectators and law students crowding every available seat. Walter took his place at the witness stand and looked out at the assembled faces, then at the defendant's table where Harold Weston sat with his co-defendants, their expensive lawyers flanking them like bodyguards. For a long moment, Walter simply looked at the man who had authorized the destruction of his life. Weston met his gaze with the cold defiance of someone who still believed himself above the consequences of his actions. The prosecutor guided Walter through his testimony, with skill building the narrative piece by piece. Walter described the Whitmore case, the theft of his evidence, the fabrication of documents designed to destroy his reputation. He described Elena's illness and death, the years of invisibility, the moment he stood up in this very courthouse to defend a woman he had never met. And then speaking directly to the jury, Walter said something that was not in any prepared statement, something that rose from the deepest part of his heart. The people who did these things believed they were untouchable. They believed their money and their power and their connections placed them above the law. They treated human beings as obstacles to be removed, as problems to be solved, as collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. He paused, letting his words settle over the courtroom. But they were wrong. They were wrong because the system they corrupted still contains people of integrity. Because truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. Because every victim they created became a witness against them, a voice that would eventually be heard. Walter turned to look directly at Weston, and his voice dropped to a register that was almost intimate. You took 15 years of my life. You killed a man who trusted me. You destroyed my ability to care for my wife when she needed me most. But you did not destroy me, and you will not destroy the next person you target because I and others like me will be watching. We will be waiting, and we will never stop fighting. The conviction came 8 weeks later, guilty verdicts on all major counts, sentences that would keep Harold Weston and his co-conspirators in federal prison until they were very old men. Walter received the news in his Brooklyn office surrounded by Rachel and Catherine and the small team of lawyers and volunteers who had become his new family. There was no celebration, no champagne or cheering. There was only a quiet acknowledgement that a long journey had finally reached its end. What happens now? Rachel asked. Walter looked around the office at the photographs of clients on the wall, at the files stacked on every surface, at the evidence of purpose that filled every corner. Now we keep working. There are more people who need help, more injustices to fight, more battles to be won. This was never about one case or one enemy. This was about building something that would last, something that would matter long after I'm gone. He walked to the window and looked out at the Brooklyn street below, at the ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the struggles that took place behind closed doors and in corporate boardrooms. My father worked in coal mines his whole life, so I could have a chance at something better. My wife sacrificed everything to support my career, and then forgave me when that career was destroyed. My daughter found her way back to me after years of distance and pain. None of that was an accident. It was all connected, all part of a story that I couldn't see until I was living through it. Walter turned back to face the people gathered in his office, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled with genuine joy. The story isn't over. It's never over, not as long as there are people willing to stand up for what's right. And I intend to keep standing up until I can't stand anymore. Rachel embraced him and Catherine clasped his hand, and outside the window the sun was setting over Brooklyn in shades of gold and crimson, painting the sky with the colors of endings and beginnings. That night, alone in his small Queens apartment, Walter sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the photographs of Elena and Rachel that had watched over him for 15 years. The apartment was the same, the photographs unchanged, but everything else was different. He was different. I kept my promise, he said softly to Elena's image. I stayed good. I stayed kind. I kept being the man you loved, even when it was the hardest thing I've ever done. And now I have a chance to do something meaningful again. To help people like my father, people who get chewed up by the system and forgotten. I think you would approve. He could almost hear her voice in the silence, warm and loving, as it had always been. I always approved, Walter. I always believed in you, even when you couldn't believe in yourself. Walter lay back on the narrow bed and closed his eyes, feeling a peace he had not known in 15 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new battles to fight. There would be losses along with victories, setbacks along with triumphs. The work would never be finished, the need never fully met. But that was all right. That was the point. Justice was not a destination, but a journey, not a trophy to be won, but a garden to be tended. It required constant vigilance, constant effort, constant faith that the work mattered even when the results were disappointing. Walter Brennan had spent 15 years invisible, forgotten, erased from the world he had once inhabited. But he had never stopped being who he was, never abandoned the principles that had defined him, never let them take his soul, even as they took everything else. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. He fell asleep with Elena watching over him and dreamed of courtrooms where justice prevailed, of workers whose rights were protected, of a world where the invisible became visible and the voiceless found their voice. The story was not over. It was just beginning.